Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So, before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. The rain began to come down hard, an unstoppable torrent lashing the windshield of my red Ford pickup, making the sound of the water crashing against the glass deafening. It was a monotonous sound, but with such force that it made it difficult to hear even my own thoughts. The sky was dark, completely covered by clouds, and the storm seemed to have no end. I felt trapped not only by the weather, but by the feeling of discomfort that had begun to grow in me, like a dull pressure enveloping me from within. I had been driving for hours, away from any hint of civilization, on a winding road that led to nowhere familiar. On this trip, I had wandered too far into unknown territory, in search of something I didn't know what it was, but felt I had to find. Now, however, as the darkness grew thicker and the storm fiercer, that sense of uncertainty had morphed into something deeper, the intuition that something very wrong was about to happen. The lights on the road flickered and went out completely, plunging me into almost absolute darkness. Only the dim light from the van's headlights illuminated the wet asphalt, creating shadows that danced along the edge of the road. In the distance, I saw what looked like a figure, something jagged on the horizon, silhouetted against the blackness of the storm. It was nothing more than a misshapen structure, but my instinct told me not to approach. It was a bad feeling that clung to my chest like a stone. But my curiosity, that spark I couldn't extinguish, pushed me forward, approaching the dilapidated construction. When the van stopped, the sound of rain intensified, a roar of water falling from the sky and pounding the earth. A shiver ran down my spine as I saw the door to the structure. There were no signs, no names, no lights to indicate that this place was habitable, just a dark and desolate space, surrounded by a mud-covered field and scattered ruins. The building had the appearance of an old farmhouse, with crumbling stone walls and broken windows that gave a glimpse of nothingness. The feeling of being in a place forgotten by time invaded me, but I couldn't help but get out of the vehicle, guided by the feeling that I should understand what was happening there. The air was heavy, damp and cold. Each step I took on the wet mud plunged me further into a sense of unease. The door of the structure closed behind me with a dull thud, and the darkness inside enveloped me almost immediately. Inside, the sound of the storm was absorbed by the thick walls, but the creaking of the wood beneath my feet and the echo of my own footsteps were enough to make everything else seem unreal. I was led down a long, narrow hallway, where the walls grew even narrower as we progressed. There were no windows, no life marks, just gray, opaque passages that made me feel that any hope of escape was slowly fading. The humidity was palpable, soaking my skin and making me feel that the structure itself was devouring me with its relentless cold. Claustrophobia gripped me, but worst of all was the feeling that something or someone was watching me. With every step, the echoing sounds of the storm outside the house mingled with the sound of my own shivering. The fear began to intensify when I was left in an empty room. There was nothing but a wooden table in the center, its surface worn by the years. Light streaming in from a crack barely illuminated the stone walls, creating shadows that danced in all directions. For what seemed like hours, I remained silent, waiting, watching the outside through the small openings. But there was nothing I could do to get out. My mind began to fragment. The hours turned into days, and my only company was the sound of the water pounding furiously against the roof of the building. At times, I could hear noises, distant footsteps, murmurs that faded away before I could identify their source. There was no way of knowing how many were there, or what purpose they served. The uncertainty became a constant torture. At some point, a figure appeared in the doorway. I could not see his face, but his presence was enough to freeze my blood. That man was not like the others. There was something in his eyes, something that conveyed a latent danger, something beyond mere threat. I was led through even darker corridors, into what seemed like a larger room. There, everything was silent, but the atmosphere was permeated by a sense of absolute control, as if every corner was designed to subdue. The movements were coordinated, calculated, as if they were waiting for something, or someone. The feeling of being one more piece of a sinister plan made me realize that there was no escape. In one of my few walks, I managed to see beyond the closed doors that surrounded me. I heard voices, some muffled by the storm, others so clear that I felt the need to hide. I saw a figure, a man sitting on the floor staring blankly. His face was empty, almost as if he had lost all hope, as if he had been banished from himself. In his eyes there was no hatred, no fear, just a strange stillness, as if he had already accepted that his fate was sealed. At that moment, I realized the rawness of what was happening in that place. The people trapped here were not simply kidnapped. They were being stripped of their humanity. The atmosphere was becoming more suffocating, more dense. At times, I felt as if the house itself was breathing next to me, as if the walls were squeezing me tighter and tighter. In my mind, the same idea kept repeating itself over and over again. Escape. But the truth slowly seeped in. There was nowhere to go. The storm never ceased, and every attempt to flee only led me deeper into the labyrinth of desolation. My only way to escape was to confront my own mind, realizing that it was not only the place that held me prisoner, but my own fears. I began to realize that the despair and confusion that overcame me were the product of my own thoughts. I was not there by accident. Somehow I had gotten here because my mind had begun to fall apart long before I was captured. The storm outside the house was just a reflection of what was going on inside me, a chaos that had taken hold of me and that I couldn't control. Eventually, I realized that my struggle was not just to escape from that place, but to find a way to regain control over my own mind. What had kept me alive up to that point was not the hope of finding a way out, but the need to face my own fears and accept that, in many cases, the greatest enemy we face is ourselves. At some point, the door to the apartment opened. It was not a door to freedom. It was just another door, one more in the endless hallway. But when I looked at it, I no longer felt the same fear. I no longer felt the need to escape. I had understood something much more important. True freedom is only found when we stop running away, when we stop fighting the inevitable. The most powerful prisons are not always the ones made of bars. Sometimes, the worst prisons are the ones we build inside ourselves. We live believing that we are prisoners of circumstance, but in reality, our greatest prison is fear, the fear of facing who we are. In a world where the storm never ceases, where the doors always seem to close, the only true way out is to learn to live with what we are, to accept our imperfections, and to understand that true freedom is not found by running away, but by facing what is within us. The rain began to fall furiously that afternoon, as if the sky wanted to overflow onto the earth. The van was struggling along the road, the windshield wipers fighting against the torrent of water that fell without ceasing. I, Guillermo Fernandez, a private driver for a sales and distribution line of high-powered motorcycles, was in the middle of a routine trip, but at that moment, something in the air told me that it would not be an ordinary day. There was something strange in the air, a tension that could be cut with a knife. The cargo I was carrying was valuable, and I knew it. Not just because of the price of the bikes, but because of what they represented. They were an order from an important client, and the company expected them to arrive safely at their destination. But what I didn't know was that something much more sinister was lurking down the road, something that would change my life forever. The storm raged more fiercely as I drove on, as if everything was turning against me. The wet asphalt reflected the headlights, and visibility was almost nil. The van's lights struggled to stay on, and every curve in the road became a challenge. I wasn't used to trips like this, but I knew I had to stay alert. The situation was not normal. At first, I didn't see anything strange. just the rain, the wind, and the constant noise of the tires on the pavement. But when I entered a desolate stretch of road, something changed. A strange noise reached my ears, as if something was following me. I looked in my rearview mirror, but all I saw was the rain lashing against the glass, creating a curtain of water that prevented me from seeing clearly. My instinct told me something wasn't right, and I wasn't wrong. Suddenly, a light shone in the side mirror. Within seconds, a black van appeared behind me, at terrifying speed, and began to approach dangerously close. I couldn't understand what was happening. There were no road signs, and no reason for anyone to follow me on such a secluded stretch. Panic began to take shape in my chest, but I couldn't let it get the better of me. I had learned to stay calm in extreme situations. My heart began to pound harder, and in the blink of an eye, the vehicle pulled alongside my truck. That's when I saw him. A man, tall, with a cold stare peering out of the passenger side window. He made no move, but his presence was more than enough for me to understand that he didn't mean well. The van stayed beside me for a few seconds, and then suddenly overtook me, completely blocking my path. My survival instinct began to kick in. I turned the steering wheel to the right and stepped on the accelerator. The van jumped down the dirt road, but the van followed my movements, not letting me escape. It all happened too fast. Fear gripped me, but I couldn't give up. I knew that if they left me trapped, the consequences would be fatal. The road became a kind of labyrinth. The rain kept pounding on the windshield, making my visibility difficult, and the sound of tires on mud and rocks created a feeling of being completely isolated, as if I was about to be devoured by the storm itself. The headlights of the van glowed in the darkness, illuminating the road ahead of me, while the roar of the engine mingled with the rumble of thunder. Minutes seemed like hours, and my mind began to wander in despair. Every time I rounded a bend, I felt the van getting closer. I didn't know what to do. If I stopped, I was lost. If he accelerated any further, he might lose control of the van. I was trapped in a macabre game that I didn't know how to escape. Finally, in a turn I hadn't anticipated, I managed to make them lose ground. I found a small curve they hadn't seen, and as I rounded it, I slid across the wet dirt, keeping the truck moving. My heart was pounding, and sweat was running down my forehead. I could think of nothing but escape. It felt as if life itself was hanging by a thread. Soon after, the van disappeared from my sight. I thought I had made it. But when I looked ahead, I saw what really terrified me. Another vehicle appeared in front of me, blocking the way. This time, there was no doubt that it was a trap. I wasn't running away. I was being hunted. My mind began to work at full speed. I had learned to deal with extreme situations in the past, but I had never been this close to death. I knew that my life was worth nothing to these men, that all they cared about was the cargo I was carrying. The clock started ticking, and the decisions became more and more difficult. The van stopped and the men began to get out. I didn't see them clearly, but their posture, their movements, told me everything I needed to know. They were experts. I didn't stand a chance. I couldn't fight them. If they let me live, it would be because I wanted something else. I felt like prey in a hunting field with no way to escape. But at that moment, desperation gave me an idea. Fear was clouding my judgment, and if I didn't do something fast, it would be the end. I made an impulsive decision. I was not willing to die there. I accelerated with all my might, passing the blocking vehicle with just inches to spare. The sound of the collision was deafening, but I made it through. The next flicker of my mind was a second of lucidity. I ran without looking back, thinking of only one thing: saving my life. The rain soaked me, the mud slowed me down, but I couldn't stop. At the bottom, I saw a curve that led me to a small side street. I knew if I could get to that street, I had a chance. The van was still behind me, but I couldn't see how close they were. I just knew I shouldn't stop. I had come this far, and I wasn't going to let it end there. Finally, I managed to lose them. The rain began to subside, and the road opened up before me like a dark tunnel. I didn't know how much time had passed. I didn't know if it had been a minute or an hour. I only knew that I had survived. The anguish I felt that night was not something I could put behind me so easily. The storm had passed, but the internal scars left by that experience lingered long after I returned to the safety of my home. Since then, I have never stopped taking precautions. I never travel unprotected, unprepared for anything. I learned that the world is not as safe as it seems, and that life doesn't always give you second chances. That night, I realized something fundamental. In life, we are not always prepared for the unexpected. Threats don't always come in the form we imagine, and while we may do our best to be prepared, we can never predict when we will be the next to fall victim to violence. The key to survival is not only in our hands, but in our ability to adapt, to make decisions at critical moments, and above all, to recognize that sometimes the only way to move forward is to face fear and learn to live with it. What saved me that night was not only my ability to drive, but my willingness not to give up. I never knew when exactly I started to become a fearful man. That day in the rain, I knew clearly. The rain not only soaked the streets, but also my soul. I, Juan Reyes, a man who had been a paramount chief in a small town, was being subjected to something I never imagined. All the power I had had, all the decisions I had made, the lives I had altered, were now reduced to a tangible and terrifying threat. Years had passed since I had been responsible for that little corner of the world, a place forgotten by most, far from the big cities and the cameras that watch everything. In that place, I made decisions that feel alien to the person I am today. Sometimes, when the nights turn dark and the rain begins to pound on the window, I find myself wondering how I got here, how a life full of ambition and control crumbled under the weight of a single secret. The storm, as always, started suddenly. I hadn't even finished entering my office when the wind swept the first drops. From my window, I could see how the city was thrown into chaos. Frantic cars trying to escape the rain, people rushing to find shelter, the dark sky and the light from the street lamps struggling to penetrate the darkness of the storm. The constant sound of raindrops crashing against the glass was unbearable to me, as if each drop was a reminder of what I had done. My mind went back to that time, to the days when the decisions I made influenced the lives of everyone in the city. I had been at the center of it all, the one responsible for determining what got done and what did not. Everyone's life depended, in many cases, on what I did or did not do. I had become the most powerful man in that little world. No one could question me. No one could stop me. That's what I thought at the time. But power has its price. It always does. And when you can no longer look back, fear begins to take hold of you. I remembered clearly the day it all started. The situation was not so different from many others. He had received a phone call. Nothing unusual in principle. I, as usual, was in my office, reviewing papers, making decisions that affected the community. But this call was different. The voice on the phone chilled my blood. They knew too much about me, about what I had done, about what I had allowed. My past, which I had carefully kept hidden, was at their fingertips. They asked me for money, an exorbitant amount. If I didn't comply, my secret would come out, and with it, my life and that of my family would crumble. Everything I had built would disappear in the blink of an eye. The call was brief, clear, and direct. No frills, no apparent malice, just a threat, pure and simple. The voice on the other end explained to me that if I didn't comply with their demands, everything would come out. I stood there watching the rain. The sound of the storm outside was intensifying, as if the sky also felt heavy from everything I had done. I could do nothing but accept. He knew there was no turning back. If I didn't pay, if I didn't obey, I would lose everything, and my family would suffer the consequences. I could not allow it. Time passed slowly as I prepared for the inevitable. I left my office, my heart pounding, echoing in my ears. The rain was still falling, relentlessly, as if the world itself was under condemnation. The streets were deserted. People had sought refuge in their homes. The air was heavy with humidity, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step I took. The shadows of the buildings seemed to lengthen towards me, as if the city itself was stalking me. My mind wandered as I walked. I thought of all that I had lost, of what had led me to make those decisions. I thought about what could have been, what I could have done differently. But the answers no longer mattered. What mattered was what lay ahead, what awaited me in that abandoned warehouse, far from the city where I was headed. When I arrived at the warehouse, the feeling of discomfort enveloped me completely. The rain was falling even harder, and the drops formed small rivulets that ran along the floor of the old factory. The place was deserted, dark, barely illuminated by a dim light that slipped through the cracks of the broken windows. I could feel the dampness in the air, the cold seeping into my bones. And although he couldn't see anything clearly, he knew he was not alone. There was something in the air, something heavy, that made me feel trapped. The darkness was all around me, consuming me. I advanced cautiously, my breathing getting heavier. Each step echoed off the walls, amplified by the silence of the night. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched did not leave me. My mind kept spinning, wondering what they wanted from me, if they had followed me there. But what terrified me most was the idea that they already knew everything. Everything I had done, everything I had hidden. Suddenly I felt a presence. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but something in the air told me I was no longer in control. My throat closed up, and fear took over completely. My breathing sped up, my pulse skyrocketed. The past was about to catch up with me. I knew it. I had tried to run from it for so long, but now it was there, right in front of me, waiting to destroy me. My life, the life I had built on lies, on wrong decisions, was in the hands of those who knew my secret, and the price for keeping it could no longer be paid with money. There was no way out of all this unscathed. My family, my life, everything was crumbling before my eyes. I walked out of there, silently, feeling as if everything was crumbling under my feet. The sound of the rain was still deafening, and when I reached my car, the fear overwhelmed me even more. The weight of what I had done pressed down on me. The money had been delivered, but my soul was still trapped in that place. I knew the threat would not end there. I was doomed to live under its shadow forever. The rain continued to fall, relentless, like a constant reminder that the past is never forgotten. The storm, which never seemed to let up, had caught up with me. Weeks passed, but the fear never went away. The storm kept hitting me, kept reminding me of what I had done. Although I had complied with its demands, the fear that someday, any slip, any mistake, could bring it all crashing down, tormented me more and more. I could no longer sleep peacefully. The weight of guilt and the constant feeling of being watched haunted me. My days seemed cloudy, as if the sun would never shine again. And worst of all, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that everything was okay, I knew deep inside that I could never escape that storm. I could never escape what I had done. In life, we think we can hide from our own mistakes, that we can distance ourselves from what we have done in the past. But sooner or later, those secrets catch up with us. The fear we feel about facing our own darkness can be greater than the weight of the guilt itself. In my case, the storm never let up. It wasn't just about the money or the threat I faced, but the fact that guilt never stops haunting us, and the fear of revelation is far more heartbreaking than any threat. Life is not always what it seems. There are secrets that, when hidden, have the power to destroy everything we have built. And that is when we realize that what really matters is not escaping, but facing who we are, what we have done. The storm may cease on the outside, but the real storm is inside us, waiting to be faced. I am Alfredo Parra, and today As the rain pounds tirelessly against the windows of my house, I realize that I am not the same man I was before all this. I have changed, without remedy. What began as a small act of bravery has turned into a never-ending nightmare, a constant storm that seems to have no end. Everything I thought I knew about the world and the people around me has been banished by mistrust. I can't sleep. I can't think clearly. I have become a man hiding from his own shadow, looking around constantly, wondering if the people I once considered close, the people who knocked on my door or sent me messages, are nothing more than pieces of an intricate game designed to destroy me. And it all started after a simple act of denunciation. I remember the day I decided to speak out. It was like any other, just another day at the company, one of those monotonous routines that repeat themselves day after day. But that day, something changed. I discovered an irregularity in the payment system. A small slip, a number that didn't add up. At first, I thought it might be a mistake, but as I investigated further, the lie spread like an oil slick. The money was disappearing, moving without explanation. It was a lot, and I couldn't keep quiet. So, without thinking too much, I reported what I had discovered. I thought it was the right thing to do, that justice would prevail, that things would return to normal once the truth came out. However, it didn't happen that way. Instead of support, what I received was a torrent of attacks, both direct and subtle. From the moment the complaint was made, something changed in the atmosphere. Rumors began to circulate in the corridors of the company. My name was mentioned in whispers, always accompanied by a furtive glance or a forced smile. The first signs that something wasn't right manifested themselves in the smallest details. Emails that didn't arrive, meetings canceled without warning, co-workers who avoided looking me in the eye. What was once a safe and predictable environment now seemed like a minefield. I soon realized that I wasn't just being attacked by the company, but by everyone around me. The smear campaign was systematic, and not just at work. The threats started coming in, anonymously, of course. No one dared to sign them, but the intensity increased as the days went by. The messages were vague at first, something like, "You know what you did. We're watching you." But as time went on, those words became more personal. No one was telling me directly, but everything told me that someone in my inner circle had decided to turn me in. Perhaps my friends, my co-workers, or even those I thought were my allies. Distrust took hold of me, and with it, paranoia. I began to watch my every move, my every word. A seemingly innocent message from a friend became suspicious. Calls that didn't worry me before now terrified me. Each of the messages I received had a different tone, sometimes more direct, sometimes more veiled, but always with the same goal: to make me doubt everything I knew. My boss's emails, initially cold but professional, became a veiled threat. Through them, I felt increasingly isolated. I couldn't trust even the smallest detail. At work, the faces of my colleagues changed. Their smiles no longer seemed genuine. Conversations became awkward. It was as if I had been branded with an invisible stamp and everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. And I was the only one who couldn't help it. The rain outside my window was constant, and it seemed to me that somehow that incessant sound was a reflection of what was going on in my mind. Anxiety began to manifest itself in my body. Every time I came home, I felt that someone was watching me from some corner, from some shadow. My own family members became suspects. Something in their looks, in their behavior, told me that I was no longer safe in my own home. Although I never got to see anything explicit, there was always that feeling, that hunch that everything had changed. Paranoia was consuming me. My thoughts were getting darker by the day. Who was behind it all? How many were there? I could feel their eyes on me, but I didn't know who to fear more. Those who attacked me directly, or those who, with a gentle smile, watched me silently. I knew that my denunciation had given rise to this chaos, but I could not help thinking that someone else, someone close to me, was taking part in this campaign. like a traitor hiding in the crowd. The days became endless, the nights longer, and the sound of the rain pounding on the roof and windows seemed a constant reminder that nothing was ever going back to the way it was. The anonymous calls continued, becoming more and more aggressive. My boss, who once seemed so cordial, now treated me with inhuman coldness. Every meeting was a test. I felt that every look was an evaluation, that every word was imbued with a judgment that I could not bear. But the worst was not the threats or the furtive glances. The worst was the constant fear, the feeling that I could not escape, that no matter how hard I tried to run, there was no refuge. The storm of distrust was unstoppable. What terrified me most was the uncertainty. I didn't know who to trust. The people around me seemed to have agendas of their own. I wasn't sure if anyone really wanted to help me, or if everyone had somehow allied against me. Sometimes I found myself alone on the street, looking around me, wondering if every passerby was part of the game, if every face hid a dark intention. Every person I came across could be another enemy. I no longer knew if the things happening around me were the result of my paranoia, or if something much more sinister was really afoot. As the days passed, the rain never stopped. I felt trapped in an endless cycle of fear and despair. The threats never went away, and although I tried to live my life as normally as possible, the shadows of doubt followed me everywhere. Sometimes when I went out into the street, I felt that someone was watching me, even from the windows of buildings. I felt that something, or someone, was always beside me, waiting for the right moment to make me fall. The feeling of being watched had become unbearable. Weeks passed, then months. My professional life was collapsing before my eyes. Opportunities were slipping away, projects were delayed. My colleagues no longer looked at me the same way. They all seemed to know something I didn't. They knew that I had been marked, that my whistleblowing had uncovered something much bigger, something I was not willing to lose. And little by little, I began to realize something much worse. The smear campaign had not only affected my work, but my personal life as well. My friends were drifting away. My family looked at me with distrust. Every time I talked about what had happened, I noticed that shadow of doubt in their eyes, that invisible distance that separated me from them. What has been hardest for me to understand is that not everything is what it seems. People I once considered close, friends I thought would never fail me, are capable of changing without warning. Trust, that invisible bond that unites us with others, is the first casualty in the path of fear and mistrust. When you get involved in a situation like the one I experienced, you begin to wonder, who is behind all this, and how far will they go? But beyond the answers I'll never get, the hardest lesson I've learned is that you can't escape the truth of yourself. Once fractured, trust is never the same. You get trapped, not by external threats, but by your own doubts that arise within your mind. And in the end, the storm falls not only on the streets, but on the soul itself. The worst thing that can happen to a man is to get lost in the fog of his own mistrust. I am Abelardo, an ordinary man with an ordinary family. I live in a city that could go unnoticed by anyone, in a simple house, with my wife Valeria and our daughter Irene. Since she was a little girl, Irene showed an unusual fascination for the world of fashion. It was not a whim, but a true passion. Every time I looked at her, I saw that spark in her eyes, that determination to be someone important in the fashion world. Me and Valeria, like any loving parent, supported her in her dream, encouraging her to go forward with all her might. I remember how, despite the difficulties, Irene was always willing to give her best. When she was 16, she participated in her first modeling contest, and from then on, my daughter's career took off. She was beautiful. She had a magnetic presence in front of the camera, and the doors to the industry opened for her. Everything seemed to fall into place. Constant work, runway after runway, and always with a smile on her face, as if there was nothing else in the world but the satisfaction of seeing her dream come true. Until one day, everything changed. The call I received I will never forget. It had been a long time since we last spoke, as Irene was already living in the city and keeping busy with her commitments. The call began simply enough. "Dad, I'm scared," said in a voice I didn't recognize. That simple phrase was enough for worry to settle in my chest. My daughter had never shown vulnerability. She had always been strong, determined. So, for the first time in a long time, I felt that something was not right. She told me that she was receiving threats, that someone was telling her that she should drop out of the modeling contest she was participating in. I thought at first that this was something trivial, perhaps a bad joke, but when I heard the fear in her voice, I knew better. Irene had never been one to dramatize things. The threat was clear and direct. Drop out, or you'll regret it. My daughter, at only 20 years old, had reached a level of success that many would wish for. She was at the pinnacle of her career, and the very thought that someone might want to destroy that future was unbearable. It wasn't just a game. I didn't know who was behind it, but the sense of danger was palpable. The worry became an obsession. I decided to investigate on my own, not only for her, but also for us, for my family. The first clues were simple, almost unnoticed. Irene didn't want to tell me more details at first, afraid to worry me, but I managed to get her to talk. She said that the threats came through anonymous messages, words full of hate and resentment. "You don't deserve to be here. They are using you. You don't know anything about the true face of the industry." Unsigned messages, but filled with a dark energy. The fact that no one identified themselves puzzled me even more. Who would want to do this to her? Why to her? As I progressed in my research, I began to discover strange things that didn't fit. The competition Irene was participating in was not just a modeling platform. It was something bigger, something dirtier. The organizers, mostly high-powered people in the fashion industry, had dark secrets hidden behind their smiles and promises of fame. Irene didn't know it, but I began to suspect that the threats were not just to her, but to everyone involved. Someone was trying to weed out the competitors, making sure that only those willing to submit to their rules were the ones left at the top. I remember spending hours sifting through the organizers' information, looking for some connection, some clue that would point me in the right direction for my investigation. I began to tie up loose ends, to find patterns I hadn't seen before. What I discovered chilled my blood. It wasn't just competition or young model envy. It was a web of manipulation, lies, and power. These organizers not only controlled the models, but everyone involved in the industry. They used fame, money, and the promise of a bright future to keep everyone under their yoke. Irene was in danger, and not just from threats. If she didn't leave the contest, if she didn't submit, she would lose everything. And worst of all, she was not alone in this struggle. There were others, many other young women who, like Irene, were caught in a net that was slowly consuming them. The rain never stopped. The sound of pounding water on the roof and windows made me more uneasy than usual, as if the weather was trying to warn me of what was happening. The pressure in my chest increased with each passing minute without finding a solution. Irene had finally decided to leave the contest, and although I felt relieved for her, I also knew that this would not end there. The people behind all this would not let their pieces go so easily. The fear that had settled in my daughter began to rub off on me. I thought that by keeping her away from this competition, we had won, but I soon realized that there was something much more sinister going on. Not only did the organizers know who Irene was, they knew who we were. I realized that they had been watching me, that our whole family had been put on their radar. I realized that the price of fame and success in this world is not paid with sacrifice alone. It is paid with a much higher price. My life began to quietly fall apart. The threats did not stop. At first, I thought they would simply stop if my daughter quit, but they did not. The calls started to become more frequent. Now they were coming to me. There was no escape. Every time I looked around, I felt that someone was watching us, that someone else knew every step we were taking. The rain, which seemed so harmless before, now seemed like a deafening noise. as if someone was waiting to catch us. I decided to take matters into my own hands and confront the organizers, but before I did, I knew I needed to be prepared. I started digging deeper, gathering evidence. The web of corruption was bigger than I had imagined, and the people involved were more powerful than I dared to assume. It wasn't just a group of organizers, it was a machinery of influence that controlled the entire fashion market, and if anyone tried to challenge their power, they disappeared. My daughter, seeing that things were not getting any better, began to fear for our lives. Her decision to leave the competition had triggered something much bigger. She knew it was no longer just her future at stake, but ours. The threats became more direct. We now knew that they were not only watching us, but that they could get to where we were. The rain continued to fall, and as the water slid down the windows of my house, I realized that, despite everything, it was already too late. We could not escape. What we had unleashed could not be stopped. The organizers, the powerful people hiding behind the shadows, would always be one step ahead. The lesson I learned, perhaps too late, is that fame and success are not always what they seem. Sometimes, when the runway lights shine too brightly, it's easy to get lost in the darkness that surrounds them. What I discovered is that the price of following our dreams can be much higher than we imagine. Fame, money, power are things that can consume us without us noticing. And when we try to walk away from them, we realize there is no way out. They turn us into pieces in a game where the rules were never ours. And when we think we have escaped, the truth is that we are never out of the reach of those who have the power to destroy us. I am Gualter Hernandez, manager of a residential complex where I have been living since 2022. It is a quiet place, farther away from the city than I would like, but perfect for those who, like me, are looking for some peace and privacy in the daily routine. The complex is made up of several houses that, although disparate in size and style, complement each other well. There was always a good harmony among the neighbors, or so I thought. Life here seemed to be marked by tranquility until that day. It all started with a common problem in any community: a breakdown in the water system. A leak in one of the main pipes had left several houses without basic service, which meant that, as manager, it was up to me to coordinate the repair. The first responses were positive. The neighbors were sympathetic, willing to collaborate to solve the problem. And that surprised me, because I knew that in many communities people were likely to complain and stay away. However, everyone seemed willing to cooperate. It was a quiet day until I arrived at house number 57. I remember the drive there as if it were yesterday. It was a rainy afternoon, something that at the time seemed like an annoying coincidence. The rain was coming down hard, making the sound of the drops hitting the streets and the windows of the houses deafening. The storm seemed to intensify with every step I took. I was already feeling tired, but I was committed to my task. The repair had to be made. The water had to be restored. As I arrived in front of House 57, a strange feeling came over me. There was something about that house that I didn't like, but I couldn't identify what it was. I rang the doorbell and waited. A few seconds later, the door opened. A man came out. I can't remember his face exactly, but I can remember the look on his face, the gleam in his eyes. There was something dark, something disturbing in his expression. His face was tense, as if something was bothering him deeply. "Can I help you?" he asked. But it was not a polite question, but something rather challenging. I don't know why, but the tone of his voice made me uncomfortable. I quickly explained the reason for my visit, which I had already communicated to all the neighbors. The repair of the water leak was a matter of urgency, and we needed his cooperation. At first, he seemed willing, but something in his body language told me that he was not entirely agreeable. His posture tensed, his hands clenched into fists, and his gaze grew stern. Before I could say anything else, he turned around and began to walk back into his house, without another word. I don't know why, but I felt something was wrong. I decided not to insist any further. I was not a man used to confrontation, and words no longer seemed to be necessary. I took a step back, but at that precise moment the door closed violently, as if an inner fury had driven him to act that way. The sound of the door closing was so loud that it made me shudder. At that instant, something inside me told me I had to get out of there. Something was not right. I started to walk quickly towards the exit of the small garden, but before I could reach the edge of the sidewalk, the door opened again, this time more violently. The man shot out at me, pushing me hard. I couldn't react in time. I lost my balance and fell to the ground, my hands scraped against the wet pavement. I felt intense pain in my shoulder, but that was the least important thing at that moment. What terrified me most was the man's behavior. He didn't seem to have any control over himself. Somehow, I managed to get up quickly, but the man was already too close. I felt his hot breath on my face as I tried to pull away, but he grabbed my arm with a force that surprised me. I had no idea what he wanted, but in his eyes shone a blind fury. I was aware that I was at risk and had no ability to act. The rain was still pouring down on us, as if the sky itself was foreshadowing something terrible. With a push, I broke free of his grip and ran without looking back. My legs were sore and my breathing was heavy, but the only priority was to escape the situation. I didn't know what else the man could do, or what had driven him to act that way. Adrenaline took hold of me as I ran through the wet streets. Arriving at my house, I closed the door behind me, trembling, my heart racing. I treated my wounds, the tears and the bruise on my shoulder, but the fear persisted. What had happened there? Why such a violent reaction? I decided not to involve the police for the moment. The man had not done anything that could be considered a serious crime, but his attitude left me with a sense of alarm that I could not ignore. Most unfortunate of all was what happened next. Over the next few days, something strange began to happen. Even though the man never reappeared, I kept feeling that I was being watched. At night, as I went to sleep, I felt a pressure in the air, as if something was lurking in the darkness. The rain continued to fall with the same intensity. The sound of the drops on the roof was unbearable to me, as if each splash of water was a threat. I was aware that something was not right, but I could not justify it. Every night it was more difficult to fall asleep. I felt that someone was watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't paranoia, it was a certainty. The man in the 57th house was nearby, and his presence had infiltrated my life. My house became a prison, and the walls, which had once provided security, now seemed insufficient. I never saw him again, but something in me told me it was no coincidence. Every time I found myself on the street, with the rain lashing my face, I felt the same sensation of being followed. It was as if he was waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows. In meetings with neighbors, his house remained closed, with no sign of life. No one mentioned anything about him, but I knew something had changed. My life would no longer be the same. Fear settled into my routine, and I was no longer able to differentiate between the real and the imagined. Every sound, every whisper in the dark, left me on edge. I no longer trusted anything or anyone. The feeling of being watched did not go away. And although the rain was always the same, always loud and heavy, now the sound terrified me. Worst of all, I never knew what exactly happened in the 57th house, nor why that man acted as he did. I only know that my life changed in that instant, and that the price of that intervention was higher than I could have imagined. Sometimes people act in inexplicable ways, and the motives behind their actions are lost in the shadows. The only thing to do is to strive for survival. Life is full of unforeseen moments that challenge us. Sometimes the dangers do not come from where we expect them, but from the closest, from those with whom we share space, without realizing what they really are. In a world where the intentions of others are a mystery, trust becomes a risk. There is something frightening in the everyday, in the seemingly normal, and the price of ignoring it may be higher than we think. I learned, the hard way, that we don't always know who is on the other side of the door, waiting for us to make a mistake. I am Javier Rodriguez. For years, I worked as a driver transporting currency and remittances for a branch of a prestigious bank in the county. My job, although routine, always gave me a sense of security. Not only was the bank a reliable institution, but it also gave me the privilege of driving an armored truck. I felt that nothing could put me in danger. After all, my daily life was predictable. Load the boxes with money, drive the familiar routes, make deliveries to branches, and come back to do it all over again the next day. Nothing in that routine made me imagine what was about to happen. No one could have anticipated it. It was a rainy afternoon like so many others when it all began. The storm was raging, and the constant sound of the rain on the truck's windshield put me in a kind of trance. I had already been driving for several hours, and the road ahead of me was one I knew well. I was halfway between two towns, where the road became narrow and lonely, and visibility was poor due to the storm. I was not worried about it. In fact, it was more like something I had experienced before. The armored truck was my refuge, and I was well aware of the risks of driving in those conditions. However, that afternoon something changed. First, there was a slight vibration in the steering wheel, almost imperceptible, which went unnoticed for a few seconds. Then the engine started making strange noises. It wasn't the normal noise I heard on a day-to-day basis. It was something that didn't feel right. I slowed down, but the sound intensified. The shaking of the vehicle became louder, and the alarm light on the dashboard blinked, telling me that something was not working properly. In my head, the puzzle piece began to fit together. Something wasn't right, and my experience was telling me that I needed to stop. Slowly, the truck began to brake on its own. It wasn't a hard braking, but I did notice that I couldn't control it completely. The force of the rain didn't help. Soon the engine was completely shut off and I was stopped in the middle of the road, with the sound of the storm filling the air. The feeling of vulnerability began to seep into my bones, something I had never experienced with the armored truck. I was all alone, halfway between two towns, with no phone and no way to call for help. In the distance, no other vehicles were visible. I was trapped. At that precise moment, I saw a car in the distance, coming down the dirt road. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, perhaps another driver caught in the storm. But as the car approached, something inside me made me feel that it wasn't so simple. The figure of the vehicle became clearer as it got closer, until it stopped right in front of me, blocking my only exit. A knot formed in my stomach. Something was not right. The car looked ordinary, but there was something strange about the calmness of the men inside it. I couldn't see them clearly, but I felt their eyes fixed on me. They were not moving. No one was getting out of the vehicle, but they knew I was there, trapped in the truck with no way to escape. I felt the cold sweat on my forehead. The tension in the air was becoming unbearable. Suddenly, one of the men got out of the vehicle, walking slowly towards my truck. As he got closer, I realized I was not alone. The other two remained inside the car, watching. The approaching man was in no hurry, walking as if he was waiting for something, and his relaxed attitude only added to my discomfort. However, deep down, what made me most uneasy was the certainty that they were watching me. It was no coincidence. The storm could not cover up that feeling that something very bad was about to happen. As soon as the man was close to the truck, I felt the tension reach its peak. These were not just passers-by or travelers. They had planned this. Something inside me knew it. My breathing quickened, and panic began to rise like an unstoppable wave. I could hear the man's footsteps outside, and then the sound of a thump against the truck's armor. It wasn't a simple accident. He was intentionally hitting me. Suddenly I understood. They wanted me to stop here. Trapped. The truck had been tampered with. The engine had been sabotaged to force me to stay in this place. I felt completely exposed. The men, it seemed, knew exactly what they were doing. There were no coincidences in this attack. The only reason it had happened was because someone had planned it. I was in a trap. Panic set in, but my survival instinct kicked in with a vengeance. I knew I shouldn't stay inside the truck. I couldn't trust the armor to protect me for long. I felt trapped. I closed the armored windows, activated the internal alarm, and tried to think clearly. I had to do something, but what? The situation was becoming more and more desperate. The men were no longer near me. They had disappeared somewhere out of my sight. It was as if they were preparing for something. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the sound of the rain. I felt I was being watched, but I couldn't see anything. The truck was still, and I was trapped inside. My mind was racing, searching for a solution, but I couldn't concentrate. Time passed slowly, and the feeling that something worse was about to happen gripped me. Suddenly, I heard the first impact against the side of the truck. A loud bang, followed by another, and then another. The men had started using a heavy tool to hit the armor, trying to penetrate it. Fear paralyzed me for a moment, but my instincts woke me up immediately. I knew I couldn't just stand there waiting. It was not safe. Adrenaline started coursing through my body as I prepared for the worst. I heard the sound of a gun being loaded, and it was at that moment that I knew I had to get out of there. The safety of the truck wouldn't do me any good if I got caught outside. Quickly, I lowered one of the armored windows just enough to escape. I jumped out immediately, without thinking. As I ran, the sound of the storm covered my footsteps, but I could also hear the screams of the men from the truck. I felt like an animal fleeing from its hunter, and desperation pushed me to continue, to seek shelter somewhere nearby. However, fear and fatigue caught up with me quickly. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police had arrived. With reinforcements, the men began to flee into the nearby forest. I couldn't see them clearly, but I felt their gazes fixed on me before they faded into the darkness. It was then that I realized I was no longer in immediate danger, but questions still haunted my mind. Why did they attack me? Who had sent them? Was it just a planned robbery, or was there something else behind it all? With my heart still racing and my muscles tense, I watched as the truck was damaged and almost unrecognizable. The rain was still falling, but to me, it was no longer just water. The storm had become a metaphor for my life, for the uncertainty that now surrounded me. What happened that night changed everything. What seemed to be a simple and safe routine became an episode of distress and danger. We convince ourselves that things are controllable, that the order of our lives is unbreakable, but all it takes is an instant for everything to collapse. Sometimes the worst dangers are not in what we know, but in what we ignore. And even if you survive a threat, the real struggle begins when you have to live with the doubt of who is behind it. I did not come out of this attack unscathed, not only because of the physical scars, but because of the marks that mistrust has left on my life. Perhaps the only thing we really know is that security is an illusion. My name is Martin, and for the past few months I have lived in a constant state of terror, one that consumes me to the depths of my being. I never imagined that the love of my life, Fernanda, the woman with whom I shared 10 years of my life, could be the reason for everything that haunts me today. It all started with her strange trip, something that at the time seemed like an innocent decision, but that I now recognize as the gateway to a dark world of which I would never have wanted to find out. It was a gray day, one of those days where the sky seems to pour down in endless raindrops. Fernanda told me she had a vacation trip planned, something that didn't strike me as odd at first. We were always a couple who enjoyed each other's company, but work obligations had me trapped. My job was all-consuming, and the idea of a break suited her. It was the first time I would be traveling alone, and although I felt a little trepidation deep down, I didn't want to ask her questions. I always respected her decisions. The day came and she said goodbye to me with a sad smile, as if something wasn't right. But, like all those little details we sometimes ignore, I just let it happen. The goodbye was short, almost automatic, as if fate was already written for that rainy afternoon. "I love you very much, Martin," he expressed to me before leaving. And although I noticed a certain distance in her words, I assumed it was because she was going alone to a country where she did not speak the language. However, she was always brave and determined. I thought maybe she was just nervous about the new adventure that awaited her. I called her minutes before she took the flight, as was customary, and heard her smile on the other end of the line. "Everything is fine," she told me, and hung up, as if there was nothing more to say. I was left with the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change my perception of her. I didn't know it then, but deep down something wasn't right. Hours passed and time began to play against me. Her flight took off, and from that moment on, my life changed forever. The following days were normal at first, but the emptiness left by her absence began to take hold of me. There was no news of her, and I found it hard to accept that she was on another continent. At first I thought she had forgotten me, that the distance had changed her, but something was bothering me. Every attempt to contact her resulted in a void, in an unavailable. Anguish consumed me, but I had no proof of anything, only the feeling that something dark was looming over me. After a week without news from her, I decided to act. I could not stand idly by while Fernanda disappeared without a trace. The woman I loved, the one I thought I knew in every detail, was slipping through my fingers like sand. The first thing I did was to try to contact Fernanda's friends, with whom I had lived with over the years. But I soon discovered that they knew nothing about her. No one had ever heard of her arrival in the foreign country. It was as if she had never existed. As the days passed, my despair turned to anger. It was as if the world was silent, denying me any kind of response. It was at that moment that I began to investigate autonomously. I knew something didn't add up, and I was determined to find out what it was. I started tracking her every move, like a detective chasing a shadow, looking for clues in the places we used to frequent. On his cell phone, I found something strange, an unsent message, something he had never shown me. An encrypted message, which seemed to talk about people and situations he never mentioned to me. The message said something like, "I can't take it anymore. They know everything." I deleted it unintentionally, a mistake I should never have made, but the feeling of fear grew more than curiosity. Who was he talking to? What did he want to tell me with those words? My research led me to something even more puzzling. I discovered that in recent months, Fernanda had been in contact with people who did not belong to her close circle. At first I thought they were just old acquaintances or co-workers, but what I found was more sinister. A network of dark contacts that extended beyond what my mind could process. People he was meeting with in secret, unbeknownst to me. It seemed he had lived a parallel life, a life he had never shared with me. It was then that I began to put the pieces together. The disappearances of other people, the rumors about a secret organization operating in the shadows, all those coincidences I had never noticed. I began to discover things that made me question everything I thought I knew about her. Fernanda was not who she said she was. The deeper I delved into the investigation, the darker the secrets I found became. A pattern began to form, one that spoke of conspiracies, of manipulations, of people disappearing without a trace. One day, I found something that almost destroyed me. An old photograph of Fernanda next to a man I had never seen. This man's face was partially hidden, but the connection between them was unmistakable. Fernanda's eyes, which had always been a refuge for me, were filled with something dark, something I had never perceived before. The image shook me to my very soul. What was really going on? Who were these people she had connected with? And why was she hiding all this from me? I decided to go further. I went to the town where she had lived during her last month before the trip. It didn't take long for the answers to come. At a local travel agency, someone recognized her face. The woman informed me that Fernanda had been in contact with a group of people who apparently did not behave like ordinary tourists. Moreover, I discovered that she had last been seen in a secluded place, a place outside the city, in an area where there was absolutely nothing. No one knew what she was doing there. The area was notorious for being difficult to access, and there was no logical reason for someone like Fernanda to have ventured into such places. Soon, the uneasiness of being watched began to invade every corner of my life. I felt that someone was following me, that I could not trust anyone. The days became nightmares, longer and longer and more tense. The rain, which had always been comforting, now seemed like an echo of the paranoia that enveloped me. People began to look at me differently, as if they knew something I could not yet understand. Even my family members distanced themselves, as if they feared I was part of something they didn't understand. The truth began to hit me like a wave of despair. Fernanda had not only disappeared, but she had left a trail of lies. Lies that I had ignored, that I never wanted to see. In her last weeks at home, she had changed in subtle but profound ways. Everything that had been a part of my life was crumbling. She hadn't just been a victim. She had been part of something much bigger, something I couldn't comprehend. And now, I was in the middle of it all. My efforts to run away from this truth led me on an aimless flight. The only thing keeping me alive was the desire to find her. But the search had made me more vulnerable. People around me began to disappear, as if they were all being devoured by something much bigger than me. Something that Fernanda had created, and that had somehow involved me without my knowing it. Everything I thought I knew about the people I love, about my life, has been left in ruins. Love, which I thought was a safe haven, has become the greatest betrayal of all. Fernanda, the woman I loved, not only disappeared, but dragged me into a world of lies and conspiracies. No one is safe from their own secrets, from the things they choose to hide. I now know that the truth can be far more dangerous than anything else that can haunt us. In life, sometimes shadows are not only created by darkness, sometimes they are forged by those we trust the most. And now, running away from what I loved is my only means of survival. November 2023. The city seemed immersed in a gray atmosphere, wrapped by a torrential rain that did not stop falling since dawn. The drops were hitting the windows furiously, accompanied by a wind that rustled the branches of the trees and made the streets slowly flood. The feeling of being trapped between the cold and the wet invaded me as I walked under the rainy dawn. I had no clear destination, only the desire to get out and clear my mind. The rain was not enough to erase my feeling of emptiness, a feeling that had accompanied me for weeks. I walked aimlessly, listening to the dull sound of my footsteps on the wet pavement. It was then that I saw her. She was on the corner, in front of a coffee shop that was closed. The image of her figure, slightly illuminated by the yellowish light of a street lamp, caught my attention like a magnet. The woman in front of me seemed to be suspended in a tableau of unattainable beauty, oblivious to the storm. Her hair was long and dark, and her face, though wet from the rain, emitted a light of its own. Her every movement was like a flawless choreography. I tried to ignore her, but I couldn't. Something about her intrigued me deeply. My heart, tired of the monotony, leapt. After all, why not? I walked toward her. Something told me that I should talk to her, that this was the opportunity that life was offering me. I didn't know what I expected from that encounter. Maybe just a conversation, or maybe something more. But I needed her. I was looking for her, without knowing it, more than anything. We looked at each other for a moment. I didn't say anything at first, just moved closer. She didn't seem surprised, as if she already expected it, as if it was all part of some hidden plan she didn't know about. Finally, I dared to break the silence. I can't remember what exactly I said, something banal, without much importance. However, his words, when he finally spoke, I will never forget. Her voice, soft and almost melancholic, enveloped me like a whisper in the storm. "I am Alejandra," she said, and her name echoed in my mind like an echo. "You studied nursing. I'm in my 3rd year." She told me she lived near my house, which surprised me, but I didn't ask questions. The conversation flowed naturally, and before long, everything else faded away. The noise of the rain, the bone-chilling cold, the fact that I was alone in an empty city, all that ceased to matter. It was just the two of us, in the rain. At the beginning, everything was perfect. The time I spent with Alejandra was like a dream from which I didn't want to wake up. She was captivating in every way. She made me feel special, as if somehow, by being close to her, I could find purpose. In her eyes, I saw something deep, something I could not define. Her fragility attracted me, but also a mysterious force that I never understood. I decided to ask her out. At first, she was reluctant. I, however, did not give in. I insisted. Days passed, and finally she agreed. We started dating. The first few days were everything I had imagined and more. Each encounter was like a bubble of perfection floating on a sea of indifference. The rain kept falling, but it didn't matter anymore. Being with her was the only thing that kept me sane. We laughed, shared stories, walked around the city. Alejandra had a smile that seemed to light up everything around her. I was convinced that I had found the person who would change my life. However, as the days went by, something began to change. At first it was little things, details that I preferred to ignore. Strange looks, long silences in which her face closed and became distant. Then everything became more and more intense. Her attitudes, once so sweet, began to become possessive. His gaze became more fixed, as if he was constantly watching me, studying me. One night, after a month of relationship, something in her clicked. She was no longer the same. She seemed to have lost control of herself, as if the whole facade she had built up had crumbled. I began to notice changes in her behavior. She was no longer the sweet, loving woman I had known. Now, every time I saw her, I felt a weight on my shoulders, a pressure I didn't know how to describe. I was caught in an invisible web. The calls became more frequent, the messages more intense. I constantly wondered what I was doing, what I was feeling, and I began to stop breathing when I saw his name on my phone screen. At first, I tried to ignore these changes. I thought everything would go back to normal, that it was just a phase. But it wasn't. I soon realized that things had not only changed, but had taken a dangerous turn. I began to be afraid. The silences between us were becoming uncomfortable, but the worst was what was left unsaid. His eyes, as deep as ever, now watched me with a sickening intensity. I knew something was wrong. His words were no longer of love, but of control. "Where are you?" he kept asking me. "Why aren't you back yet?" The fact that she could manipulate my emotions terrified me. The tension grew more and more, until one night, after a prolonged silence, something happened. It was so sudden that I didn't know what to do. We were in my apartment, and Alejandra had arrived unannounced. I didn't ask her how she had gotten the key, because deep down, I already knew the answer. She watched me as if she was studying my every move, as if she wanted to know me to the last corner of my being. I was trapped in his world, and I didn't know how to get out of it. Suddenly, the atmosphere became unbearable. His behavior became increasingly erratic. He started talking about things he didn't understand, mentioning medical practices, how everything he had learned in his studies had to be tested. I didn't understand at the time what he was referring to, until I saw him. It was as if everything he was telling me was a rehearsal for something macabre. His obsession with medicine and the way he began to treat me, as if I were an experiment, chilled my blood. That night, I realized that I was no longer safe. I could no longer trust her. Alejandra had transformed into something else, something I could not recognize, and her obsession to control and dominate me knew no bounds. I woke up, but it was as if I could not escape the nightmare. Everything that had been perfect had now become hell. The days that followed were even worse. He stalked me, watched me relentlessly. His presence crushed me. I knew I was falling apart, but she enjoyed it. As time went on, I felt smaller and smaller, more and more insignificant before her will. My thoughts were getting darker and darker, as if I was being consumed by something bigger than me. I couldn't get out of that relationship anymore. I couldn't get out of his trap. One night, after days without sleep, I felt an impulse. I needed to escape, to run away from her, from the psychological torture I had begun to suffer. The rain was still falling, the same rain that had marked the beginning of our relationship. It was as if the weather was mocking me. I ran towards the street, aimlessly, without thinking of anything else. I just wanted to disappear. Now, as I write these words, I realize what I have lived through. This story is not only mine, it is of all those who have let themselves be trapped by something or someone that seemed perfect, only to discover too late that it was all a facade. I may never really escape all of this, but what I do know is that I am no longer looking for what once made me feel so alive. I've learned that what looks beautiful, what seems perfect, can hide the deepest darkness. Sometimes what we fear most is not outside, but within those we choose to trust. What seemed like a dream became my worst nightmare. And in the end, what scares me most is not what I already lived, but what could have been if I hadn't escaped. The cool morning air hit my face as I left the house. The rain was coming down hard, as if the sky had decided to vent all its sadness on the earth. I looked around, making sure everything was in order before I left. I knew I was going to be gone for more than 45 days, but I had no choice. Vacation with the family was imminent, and although the trip made me uncomfortable, seeing them was something I didn't want to miss. I drove away from the house with a strange feeling, as if something was about to happen, although I could not identify what. The first few hours of the trip were quiet. As I waited for my first flight, the constant sound of rain pounding on the airport windows accompanied me. I was tired, but the thought of seeing my family after so long kept me motivated. As the hours passed, my mind began to imagine all that we would do together, the conversations, the family meals, the laughter. But what happened shortly thereafter completely altered my thoughts. 25 hours into the trip, when I was already far from my city, I received a message. The photo showed my house, taken from an angle I didn't recognize. Something about that picture disturbed me, but what disturbed me even more was the number from which it had come. It was not mine, not even the phone number of an acquaintance, an unknown number. My mind started racing. Questions flooded my head. Who could be in my house? Who was behind that picture? I felt a knot in my stomach. The idea that someone had broken into my home terrified me. It was something I had never considered. I rushed through my mail and my social networks, looking for some clue, something that could reassure me, but I found nothing. I decided to move on. There was nothing I could do from where I was. At least there was still my second flight, the one that would finally take me to be with my family. I was worried, but the excitement of seeing them, of leaving behind that bad feeling, made me go on. The flight was long, but we finally landed. The chill in the air chilled my bones as we exited the plane, but at least the weather was more familiar. At that moment, my mind tried to forget about the pictures, about the uncomfortable feeling that had been growing in me. I was with them, with the people I cared about. And yet, I couldn't help but check my phone one more time, as if something was urging me to do so. I received 2 new photos. One was of my bed, but what I saw made me shudder. On the sheets, in the exact center of my bed, was a wilted flower. The second photo was even more disturbing. Blood. A pool of blood on my bed. My breathing quickened. The messages began to pile up. What did this person want from me? Why was he sending me these images? It was as if everything I had planned, the joy of seeing my family, was falling apart in the face of a series of disturbing and increasingly personal messages. The storm of thoughts in my head wouldn't leave me alone for the first few days at home. I tried to distract myself, laugh with my family, enjoy the little things, but the weight of those messages was still present. I knew I could no longer ignore them. Something was telling me that I had to go back, that something wasn't right. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew I had to face whatever was going on in my house. so I made the decision to return earlier than planned. As I took the flight back, anguish enveloped me. I knew something was waiting for me. I was not prepared for what I was going to find. The return to my home was not as I had imagined. When I arrived, the rain was back, even harder than before. Drops hit my face as I walked home, each step filled with uncertainty, fear throbbing in my chest. When I arrived, silence greeted me. The door was closed, but it didn't reassure me. I entered cautiously, as if I expected someone to be watching me from the shadows. Nothing seemed out of place, but something in the air told me that everything had changed. At first, I thought I might be imagining things. The lights were off, the house seemed empty, but the uneasy feeling didn't dissipate. I didn't want to go to my room, but my feet led me there, as if an outside force was commanding me to. As I entered, my heart stopped. There were no flowers on the bed, no blood, but she was there. There she was. Alejandra. I did not recognize her immediately. I could not. Her face was covered by a strange mixture of despair and a smile that froze my blood. Her presence was like a shadow, like something that had been lurking in the corners of my mind the whole time. I didn't know how he had gotten there, or how he had done what he had done, but at that moment I understood that it wasn't just a message, it was her. Alejandra had been behind everything, and now she was in front of me. The worst thing was that I could not escape. I knew I could not leave the house without facing what I had started. I was trapped, and from that moment on, what happened was a series of horrors that I will never forget. Alejandra watched me all the time, her gaze fixed and penetrating, as if studying my every move. Her control over me was absolute. I did things I never imagined I would do, things I don't want to remember. Every command, every action, plunged me deeper into a spiral of despair. For days, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police. I couldn't trust anyone. She had everything under control. The house was locked. The world outside seemed non-existent. In my mind, all that remained was the torture, the constant fear, the whisper of her presence. She knew she had broken me. And the worst thing, what hurt me the most, was the realization that I was no longer the same person. She had gotten what she wanted. She had taken my peace, my freedom, my life. Finally, one night, when I could not take it anymore, I understood everything. Alejandra was not just a disturbed woman. She was the reflection of something much darker, something that hides behind the people we know. What makes someone become like this? What brings us to the point of losing all humanity, of treating another being like a chess piece that moves at our whim? Alejandra was not just a storm in my life. She was the lesson I never wanted to learn. Today, as I write, I try to understand what has remained of me. I am not the same person who went on vacation. I have changed in an irreversible way. The fear is still with me, and every time I hear the sound of rain, I know the storm will never completely go away. But there is one thing I have learned. We are all vulnerable. Sometime, somewhere, evil may be closer than we imagine, and by the time we face it, it's too late to turn back. We may never find an answer to why these things happen, but perhaps the most important lesson is that true darkness doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it is inside the people we know, waiting for the right moment to come to light. I am Cesar Campos, a pure physics teacher in a small town. I arrived here a couple of months ago, not really knowing what to expect, but hoping that the change of environment might be what I needed to disconnect a bit from the city. The place was quiet, the people friendly, but everyone knew each other. The stories of neighbors, of families, intertwined as if time was a spider's web in which everything was trapped. I was the newcomer, the outsider who was just beginning to know their faces. The classes were not difficult to teach. The young people there seemed to be intelligent, motivated, although most of them were used to a traditional type of teaching, which did not leave much room for experimentation. That worried me at first, because my methods were different. I often asked my students to experiment on their own, to question what they knew, to challenge the rules, something that was usually welcomed in larger cities. But here, in the village, it was uncharted territory. It wasn't long before a small group of them began to voice their discontent. Their eyes, once curious, began to reflect distrust. They called me too theoretical, too aloof. They even called me bland, boring, because I didn't give them easy answers. But that didn't worry me. I didn't think it was anything serious, just a minor disagreement that would settle with time. After all, young people are volatile, and sometimes they just need some space to adjust. But what started out as simple whispers soon turned into something more. I started receiving anonymous, threatening letters about what would happen if I didn't change the way I taught. The messages were short, direct, and cold. Watch what you do. If you don't change, you will learn the consequences. At first I thought it was a joke, one of those juvenile antics that one should ignore. However, the uneasy feeling began to creep into me. My nights became longer, the hours of sleep shorter. I knew something was not right. Despite the growing tension, I tried to ignore it. I decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. I thought it was just a phase. But when the threats became more detailed, I could no longer be so optimistic. I began to investigate, to look for clues, to decipher who might be behind those words. After several days of watching, of unsuccessful probing, one name began to repeat itself in my mind. Lucas. Lucas was one of the young men in my group, a boy known in town for his explosive temper. His parents, though respected, always spoke with a certain tone of concern when referring to him. They knew Lucas had been in trouble in the past, but they didn't want anyone to know about it. Rumor had it that he had been involved in some violent incidents, although there was never any concrete proof. However, his attitude left no room for doubt. His eyes, dark and piercing, were always on the verge of provocation. There was something about him that put me on alert, something that made me uncomfortable, and now those threats seemed to be aimed directly at him. I decided to confront him, or at least find out the truth. I had to know if it was really him, or if this was all just a teenage game. I followed him for a few days, discreetly, trying to pick up any clues that would confirm my suspicions. And indeed, one day I saw something that left no room for doubt. Lucas was following me, at a safe distance, but with a precision that made my blood run cold. It was him. Fear began to take control of my body. My mind filled with questions and, worst of all, doubts. What should I do? Denounce him and risk a storm of unforeseen consequences? Or ignore him and hope that everything would calm down by itself? Time seemed to be on his side. His threats were becoming more and more pointed, more specific. These were no longer vague messages. He now knew what she was doing every hour of the day. He knew when I left the house, when I got to class, even when I drank my coffee in the morning. Fear settled into my daily life, and it was impossible to ignore. One day, after class was over, I stayed in the teacher's lounge to review some papers. I knew something was not right, that things were about to escalate. I felt a growing pressure in my chest, as if the air was getting thicker, as if something was about to happen. I was about to leave when the door opened. I didn't see who came in, but I knew instantly. It was Lucas. He said nothing, but his presence filled the space with palpable tension. The door closed behind him, and my heart began to pound. He wasn't the rebellious boy he used to be. He wasn't the person I wanted him to be. He was someone different. With an eerie calm, he slowly approached, his eyes fixed on mine. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. A few seconds later, he stared at me and told me that if I made him lose the exam, I would lose something much more valuable. Fear completely took over me. His threat was no longer a joke, no longer a simple provocation. It was real, tangible, and worst of all, I knew I had the power to carry it out. At that moment, everything I had been fearing, everything I had been trying to ignore, became present. He wasn't a rebellious kid. He wasn't just a troubled young man. Lucas was something much more dangerous, much darker, and I had underestimated him. In that instant, everything I had learned, everything I thought I knew about people and situations, came crashing down. I was trapped. Lucas was in control. He could not escape. The threats became more and more specific, more and more vicious. With each passing day, I felt more powerless, smaller in the face of something I couldn't control. The life I had known up to that point was crumbling. Things escalated quickly. The next few days were a nightmare that repeated itself over and over again. Every moment, I thought that maybe this time would be the last time I would see Lucas, that maybe everything would work out. But it didn't. The young man managed to make me lose control, and worse, he managed to make me lose my peace of mind. Fear became a constant, something I couldn't shake. I was no longer the teacher I had been before. I no longer had the calm that characterized me. And worst of all, I could not forget what I had done, what had happened. One day, after days of anguish, I managed to escape from his power. It was not easy. It cost me more than I thought. But in the end, I denounced him. The police arrested him, and now he is in prison. But even though he is there, his shadow still haunts me. Today, I am no longer a teacher. The life I had known has vanished, and there is no going back. I can't undo what happened. Lucas was a reflection of something much deeper. He made me realize that evil doesn't always come from what we imagine. We don't need ghosts or monsters to live a nightmare. The worst darkness can be in the people closest to us, those around us who seem harmless. And the scariest thing of all, we never know what is hidden in their minds. The truth is that there is nothing more dangerous than underestimating people, than ignoring the signs they show us, even if they seem harmless. The reflection is simple. Sometimes, the greatest danger is closer than we think. And there are moments in life that mark us in such a way that we are never the same again. Fear is a constant companion when we discover that the greatest danger is not outside of us, but inside. My name is Mark, and less than a year ago, I started working for a well-known high-end cell phone agency. It was a job that in theory should have been an amazing opportunity. The salary was good, the environment was promising, and the idea of belonging to a reputable company made me feel like I was on the right track. However, I soon discovered that things are not always what they seem. The first few days were a mixture of excitement and nerves. As a new employee, I was introduced to everyone, given the basic instructions and let me get to know the workflow. Everything seemed straightforward and fairly standard. But at the same time, there was something strange about the place. People seemed polite, but there was an uncomfortable atmosphere that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't necessarily hostile, but there was something that didn't quite fit. It was as if I was being watched, as if I wasn't completely welcome. At first, everything seemed pretty normal. A couple of jokes about my lack of experience, about how different my accent was, about how nervous I was at first. I thought it was part of the process, a rite of passage that all new employees had to go through. Soon, however, those jokes began to take a strange turn. They became more personal, more incisive. One afternoon when I returned from lunch, I found a note on my desk, written in unmistakable handwriting. "I hope you don't lose your phone." It was something so simple, so brief, that I didn't think of it as anything more than a silly joke, but something deep down made me wonder, why would anyone feel the need to leave me such a message? The jokes continued, some with more black humor than others. "Did you notice that your phone has the same model as mine? What a coincidence." Or, "Were you aware that high-end smartphones can be hacked easily? Don't let them steal from you." At first I tried to downplay it. I thought it was just office gossip, that maybe the stress of projects was starting to get to all of us. But the discomfort began to grow on me. My anxiety began to increase, and the environment that once seemed welcoming was becoming oppressive. Peer behavior began to change as well. Conversations around me became more tense. There was something about the way they looked at me, as if they were waiting for me to react, as if they knew something I didn't. I felt out of place, as if I was out of my depth. I felt out of place, as if everyone was conspiring against me. I didn't want to be paranoid, but the uneasiness was slowly eating away at me. One afternoon, after spending the day in a meeting, I returned to the office. My desk was just as I had left it, but something was different. The phone was on the table, turned on, with the screen illuminated. On my first impulse, I thought someone had inadvertently touched it. However, as I looked at the screen, my heart stopped. They were text messages, messages I had not sent. In each one, a cryptic and disturbing message. "You know, don't you? We're always watching." Another held, "Don't forget what I've told you, there's always something extra." Sweat ran down my back. Who was behind this? How could he be sending these messages without me knowing? The feeling that I was being watched, that something strange was happening, came over me. It was as if all the air in the room became thick. Trying to stay calm, I decided to delete the messages, turn off the phone and block any unknown numbers. But the feeling of insecurity wouldn't leave me alone. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as if someone was at the edge of my vision, watching me, waiting for me to realize something I didn't know. Days passed, and the jokes stopped being just innocent comments. The threats became more explicit, more direct. Every time I left the office at night, I felt that someone was following me in the distance. Something inside me told me that something was terribly wrong, but I could do nothing to stop it. Every step out of the office was mental torture. I found myself avoiding contact with others, fearful of being seen or heard. I felt that everyone was aware of what was going on, and that maybe I was going crazy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone knew something about me, something I had never shared, something about my personal life that I had never mentioned. At first, I thought it was paranoia, but when the worst happened, I knew my fear had a real basis. One morning, coming back from my break, I found my phone on the floor. The screen was broken. I sat, transfixed, staring at the shards of glass scattered on the floor, wondering how it had gotten there. No one had walked by my desk, no one had touched anything. There was no logical explanation for it. But the worst was yet to come. A photo appeared on the broken screen. It was a blurry image, taken from the street near my window. My heart stopped for a second. How could they know where I lived? How had someone been so close to my house without me noticing? What did they want from me? The feeling of vulnerability, of being completely helpless in the face of something I didn't understand, completely overcame me. Every nerve in my body was tense. Every muscle was on alert. I wanted to scream, to run away, to do something, but I didn't know what. My mind was caught in a spiral of fear and confusion. Over the next week, my worst fears were confirmed. The threats went to another level. I began receiving photos from my neighborhood, images that had clearly been taken from the street. Sometimes the messages contained details about my personal life, about my habits, about things I had never mentioned to anyone. Who was behind all this? What did they want? Was there something else behind the jokes and comments? My mind could no longer process it. I began to distrust everyone. No one seemed to be who they said they were. Finally, I came to the conclusion that I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to quit. I was no longer able to continue working in that place, with the constant feeling of being watched, of living in a constant state of terror. The damage was done. I had lost much more than a job. I had lost my peace, my tranquility, my sense of security. I could no longer walk down the street without looking over my shoulder, without feeling that someone was nearby stalking me. Today, months after leaving my job, I am not the same person. I am no longer the man who once dreamed of working in a big company, of having a normal life. Now, I live in constant fear that something terrible could happen at any moment. Every message, every call, every person on the street has become a threat. Paranoia has invaded me, and I know I can never escape it. Even though I'm trying to get my life back on track, The traces of that experience are imprinted on me forever. What I learned from all this is simple, yet profound. Never underestimate what others are capable of, and never blindly trust what appears to be harmless. The real threat can be hidden behind a joke, behind a smile. People are not always what they seem, and sometimes the worst enemy is the one who is closest to you, the one who looks at you with the most familiar eyes. Trust is a gift, but once it is broken, it is almost impossible to repair. And sometimes, fear is the price you pay for having believed that nothing bad could happen. The sound of the rain hitting the window will always remind me how vulnerable I am. The feeling that someone might be watching haunts me with every step I take, and even though I try to move on, I know I'll never be the same. My name is Eric, and the story I'm about to tell happened during my senior year of high school several years ago. It is a story that I never imagined I would share, much less that it would mark me in such a profound way. During my time as a student, I experienced something that, although it happened so long ago, continues to haunt me every moment of my life. I was always a quiet kid. I was neither the most popular nor the most invisible. I was in the middle of everything, in a safe place where no one bothered me too much, but I didn't stand out for anything either. I liked to read, walk alone, and I always preferred a good book to empty conversations in the hallways. My friends, the few I had, were just as quiet as I was. We would often meet in the library or in some coffee shop to discuss trivia that made us laugh. We were a small group, but unlike many others, we never got into trouble. However, everything began to change when the rain, one random afternoon, seemed to fall with an intensity that did not bode well. It wasn't just the sound of the drops hitting the windows, or the wind rustling the tree branches outside the building. There was something in the air, something that could not be identified, but could be felt. The feeling that time had stopped to witness something that would irreversibly mark my life. It was just another afternoon of classes, an ordinary day, until I passed by the most popular group of kids at school. I already knew them well, of course. I saw them every day in the hallways, at recess, dominating the conversation with laughter and jokes that, while they didn't bother me, always made me feel like I didn't belong. They seemed to have everything: the attention of others, the admiring glances, the privileged places. I, on the other hand, was just a spectator, someone who stayed out of it all. What I didn't know was that that afternoon my destiny would cross paths with them in a way I never imagined. At first, it was just a glance, a look that, unbeknownst to me, would mark the beginning of something that would change my life completely. Suddenly, one of them, a tall guy with an arrogant smile, stared at me. I didn't say anything. I tried to go unnoticed, as usual, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. I stopped for a moment, a second that seemed eternal. That's when another one joined the scene, and then another. I began to feel a pressure in the air, something heavy, as if they were preparing for something. I tried to keep walking, but it was too late. Abruptly, one of them came up and gave me a push. At first I thought it was a joke, something I was missing, but what came next was much more than a joke. I was pushed into a corner of the hallway, a space away from the other students. And in that corner, I began to live a nightmare I didn't understand, one that was completely beyond me. What started as teasing quickly turned into something much darker. It wasn't just teasing. It wasn't just light-hearted remarks. I felt trapped, completely vulnerable. They knew it. They felt it in their control over me. Every word they said, every gesture they made, plunged me deeper and deeper into a sense of helplessness. They made me do things I never thought I would be able to do, things I can't count. They ridiculed me, made me feel small, insignificant. Every word was like a dagger, every laugh a reminder of how helpless I was at that moment. The rain was still falling outside, but inside that hallway, in that dark corner, everything seemed to have stopped time. The fear was so intense that I felt as if my body was floating, uncontrollably, while they were having fun at my expense. When they finally let me go, I felt something had changed inside me. My legs were shaking, and although they told me it had all been a joke, something in their gaze told me that for them it had not been a game. It was their way of showing who was in charge. My life at school was never the same after that day. I could never walk the halls again without feeling watched, without feeling that every glance was filled with judgment. I became a spectator, a shadow of my former self. I could no longer laugh at jokes, could no longer look at others without feeling that constant pressure of being the center of something I wanted no part of. The worst came later, when I discovered that everything that had happened would not be forgotten. A few days later, when I least expected it, someone left a note in my locker, a veiled but clear threat. Do you think we forget so easily? And worst of all, that note came accompanied by a picture that had been taken of me in that very corner of the hallway, at the very moment I was humiliated. My heart stopped when I saw it. They had not only manipulated me, they had recorded me. And everything that happened was spreading through the school, slowly, like an oil slick on water. For weeks, school was a nightmarish place for me. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't think about anything but what had happened. My classmates looked at me differently, some with sympathy, others with mockery hidden behind a smile. I no longer wanted to be there. The fear I felt became a constant shadow that haunted me. I couldn't talk to anyone. I couldn't say what I felt. I was alone. Finally, I decided I had to escape. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked away from everything, stopped going to school for a few days, hoping that everything would calm down, hoping that the storm would pass. But the damage was already done. The humiliation, the fear, the insecurity that had been planted in me could not be erased by simply taking a break. I was no longer the same. In the end, I couldn't go on with my life as before. The scars were invisible, but they were always there, lurking in every step I took. The trust I had had in others faded, and though I tried to go on, I could never forget what had happened. They stole my peace, my confidence, my essence. After all, the worst part of that experience was not what happened in that corner of the hallway. The worst part was the weight of loneliness, the burden of living with the feeling that even though no one saw me, everyone knew. Today, years later, I still bear invisible scars, with that fear that, though I try to keep it hidden, is always there, lurking in the shadows. Life goes on, but I was never the same. The memories of that rainy day, of that humiliation, are still present. And every time I hear the sound of the rain hitting the windows, I wonder if I will ever be able to let go of that fear. What I learned is simple, but painful. Human cruelty is unpredictable, and the damage one person can inflict on another knows no bounds. Once fractured, trust is never the same, and although time passes, the scars of the soul remain the most difficult to heal. My name is Andres, and what I am about to tell you is not a story to scare you, or to make you think that this only happens to some people. What I will tell you was my reality, one that changed me completely, and although some time has passed, the traces are still there, invisible, but always present. Traces that perhaps, if I had not crossed paths with certain people, would never have existed. But here I am, willing to share my story, because I believe there is something important in it that can serve as a lesson. I was never an exceptional player. I was a novice, yes, but I had passion, and with enough dedication I thought that someday I could get better. In the beginning, everything seemed simple. I had a group of friends who had invited me to join their team. The idea of belonging to something filled me with hope. It was more than just playing. It was being part of a group, of a community. At the time, everything looked perfect. A group of online gamers who felt like a second family. And no, it was nothing special, just an online gaming team competing in minor tournaments. But for me it was everything. The early days were quiet. I played the best I could, learned what I could, and although I wasn't the most skilled, I was having fun. I thought time would do the rest. But it wasn't long before I started to notice something strange. something that wasn't so obvious at first, but soon began to come to light. The veterans, those players I thought were my support, started to tune me out. My mistakes were constantly pointed out, as if my simple failures were unforgivable. The comments were not constructive. They began to mock my decisions, to criticize me for no reason, and although I tried to improve, it seemed that everything I did was insufficient for them. I clearly remember one of those nights. I was playing an important game, one of those moments when the whole team must be aligned to win. In that game, I made a serious mistake, something even I couldn't forgive myself, and the reaction was instantaneous. A mocking comment, a criticism that sounded more like humiliation than correction. I felt the pressure, the disdain, and that made me make even more mistakes. But in that instant, the mockery morphed into something darker. They isolated me. They would stop talking to me during games. They would exclude me from team decisions. They would even let me play alone, on purpose. Every time I tried to improve, they just made it harder. Weeks went by, and although in theory I was still part of the team, the truth was that I was no longer welcome. My presence had become uncomfortable for them, and worst of all, they knew how to manipulate things so that I was the one who seemed out of place. Not only did I feel left out in the game, I was left out in real life as well. I was no longer getting invitations to online meetings. I was no longer receiving messages. I was simply no longer part of their group, and they knew it. It was at that moment that I decided to make a decision. I could no longer be their victim. I knew that if I kept it up, I would sink even lower. I decided to move, to leave everything behind, to start somewhere else, with other people. I thought that, by changing my environment, my life would change, that I could be someone different, far from the painful memories of that group. I thought that what was happening to me was just a rough patch, something I could fix. It was in my new neighborhood that things started to get really dark. The move was harder than I imagined. Even though the new house was bigger, there was something unsettling about the neighborhood. The houses looked older than the pictures showed. The streets were empty, and often the wind brought with it the sound of rain hitting the windows. At first I thought it was just a weird feeling, a passing thing. But soon I understood that the place was bleaker than I had anticipated. It wasn't many days before I noticed that there was something strange around me. A group of boys around my age began to notice me. It was nothing special at first. They would glance at me from time to time. Their eyes seemed empty, but I didn't ask many questions. However, as time went on, I began to notice their gazes lengthening. What started out as simple observations turned into something uncomfortable. They would follow me on my way to work, or watch me from a distance, as if they were waiting for something. But it wasn't until I began to hear the murmurs, the laughter in the air, that something inside me began to become alarmed. One day, as I was walking home from work, I noticed the boys following me. I didn't dare look back, but I felt their footsteps, the weight of their presence behind me. No matter how much I quickened my pace, I never seemed to get far enough away. I arrived home with my heart racing, breathing deeply, trying to calm my anxiety. I thought maybe I had overreacted, but that night, I couldn't help but hear something. Soft knocking, as if someone was looking for something at the door. At first I didn't respond. I thought it was an illusion. But the knocking continued, more intense, and it started to sound louder, as if they were trying to make me react. I didn't come out, of course. I couldn't risk it. I didn't know what they wanted. For days I stayed locked up, not daring to go out, wondering what I had done to attract so much hatred, so much negative attention. The only thing I knew for sure was that something dark was weaving around me. Sometimes, even from the window, I could see them lurking around my house, as if they were waiting for me to make a mistake, something that would let them into my life. And so the days went by, until something in me clicked. I could no longer live with this fear, with the constant paranoia. I decided I had to do something about it. I could no longer run away. At first I thought about reporting it, going to the police and telling them what was going on. But I knew that if I did that, things would only get worse. They knew I felt vulnerable, that I couldn't trust anyone. If I reported them, surely my life would become an even worse hell. I felt trapped, with no way out, and fear had taken over my mind. The feeling that they were stalking me would not let me live in peace. Time passed, and the rains never stopped. Anxiety devoured me, and every time I heard the rain hitting the windows, I felt as if I was locked in a prison, with no possibility of escape. I knew I couldn't go on living like this, but I didn't have the strength to face what was coming. I could no longer play. I was no longer a player. Now, I had become the game. I was breaking inside, and the only way out seemed to be to talk to my father. But even that didn't seem enough. What would he do? How could he protect me from something so insidious, so dangerous, without letting it all blow up? My life was in danger, and although I knew what I had to do, I feared that, in the end, the solution would only bring more destruction. Finally, after days of stormy weather, I plucked up my courage. I knew that when faced with this situation, nothing would ever be the same again. But I also understood something. In the end, the real battle was not against them, not even against the shadows that haunted my life. It was against myself, because only by facing my fears could I begin to rebuild my life. The first step was to speak, even if the cost of that first step meant the end of many things. And so, with the rain still beating against my window, I prepared to tell my father everything. Because in the end, the only way to win the game is to stop being part of it. What I learned is that sometimes we are not fighting what seems like an external enemy, but our own insecurities, fears, and the idea of being an easy target. Fear can control us to the point where we stop living our lives the way we really want to. We can't stop others from hurting us, but we can decide how we react, how we deal with the terror. The first step is always the hardest, but it is the one that sets us free. My name is Ricardo, and I recently made the hardest decision of my life. Today, after everything that happened, I want to tell my story, although I know that doing so will not change what I lived through. I don't regret what I did, but the consequences continue to haunt me, even now. It all started a few years ago, when my father, an elderly man, was admitted to a nursing home. At the time, I had no idea what was really going on there. I only knew that he needed care and that I could not offer him everything he required. I thought I was doing the right thing, choosing a place with a good reputation. But all I found in that nursing home was the dark face of human cruelty, and at first I didn't understand it. My father began to complain about what was happening to him there. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him. I thought that the words of an old man might be the product of confusion or loss of faculties. He was saying strange things that I wasn't sure could be true. He told me about how some of the residents bullied him, how the medical staff treated him with indifference, and even how he felt some of them secretly beat him. But what bothered me most was that there was no proof. No one believed me when I told them what he said. I decided to investigate, although I didn't know where to start. It was then that I came up with a terrible idea, but one that I felt was the only way to find out the truth: to enter the asylum as a patient. I wanted to see with my own eyes if what my father said was true. I pretended to be someone else, someone who wouldn't attract attention, someone who could move around without suspicion. I used a false identity, and within days, I was in. The first night was indescribable. I didn't know what to expect, but when I found myself surrounded by older people, some so lost in their minds that they barely seemed to notice my presence, I felt an indescribable chill. The infirmary seemed to be overflowing, the corridors dark, the lights flickering. But what chilled me the most was what I began to notice in the days that followed. At first, I observed what seemed to be routine at the nursing home. Residents were fed, groomed, and treated by the staff. But as the days passed, I began to notice the cracks in that facade of normalcy. There was something unsettling in the eyes of some of the patients, a kind of terror that I couldn't explain. Others simply looked resigned, as if they could no longer do anything. But the worst were the attitudes of the staff. Some of the nurses and aides showed an indifference bordering on cruelty. Others, with whom I had had the opportunity to interact superficially, looked at me with a strange smile, something that did not convince me at all. Gradually, I began to see the evidence of what my father had said. Some nights, when the hallways were silent, the nervous murmurs and laughter of some of the employees would creep through the walls. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but soon, what started as small innuendos turned into something more. I saw how some of the residents were treated with contempt, with acts of violence occurring quickly, without anyone intervening. I remember one particularly dark night when one of the patients fell out of his wheelchair and, instead of helping him, a nurse laughed at him and left him there, lying there, as if he were just another object. I knew something horrible was happening, and I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. But there was a problem. I was trapped there too. The violence wasn't just from the staff toward the patients, although it was the most obvious abuse. The residents also seemed to have succumbed to the chaos. Some were grouped in small circles, making low, sometimes cruel comments toward the weaker ones. There was something sick in that place, something that had taken hold of the most vulnerable. And though I tried to reach out to other patients to get more information, I found that many of them no longer had the ability to think clearly. They were broken, their spirits crushed by years of abuse. However, the real horror did not come from the actions of the patients or the nurses. It was a discovery I made one rainy afternoon, as I walked through the halls of the asylum. I was heading toward the common room when I saw a couple of employees talking quietly, amidst laughter. I didn't try to get too close, but one sentence slipped in between their words, one that chilled my blood. "I don't know if he'll survive the next week. He's already too weak. Don't you think it would be easier to get rid of him?" I thought I hadn't heard correctly. I thought it was another meaningless comment. But the sick feeling wouldn't leave me. The next day, I looked for the patient they were talking about, and when I finally found him, his unhinged face made me fear the worst. He looked more dead than alive, with an extreme pallor and a tremor that could not be normal. That very night, I decided I couldn't stay another minute. What I was experiencing, what I was discovering, was too much. I had seen enough to know that my father had not exaggerated, but I also knew that, if I stayed there, things could get worse. My health, my safety, even my life, were at risk. I decided to leave. I left the asylum that same night, unnoticed, determined to get my father out of that place as soon as possible. I plucked up courage, and with the help of some acquaintances outside the asylum, I managed to get my father out of there. It wasn't easy, and guilt hit me every time I thought about what I had to do to get him out. But I did it. I got him out, got him to safety. And for a while, what I feared was the worst seemed to be behind me. But I was wrong. The darkness never really went away. From that point on, my life became a nightmare. Someone, or something, began to haunt me. It wasn't a ghost or a supernatural presence, but something far more terrifying: revenge. Shortly after my father was transferred, threats began to arrive. Anonymous calls, strange emails, and finally, people appearing in the vicinity of my house without me being able to understand why. My life had become a battlefield. I could no longer leave the house without looking over my shoulder, without feeling that I was being watched. The constant feeling of danger was unbearable. Worst of all was not the fear I felt during those days. The worst was the realization that, even if I managed to rescue my father, I could not save everyone in that place. There was something much darker, much more serious in that asylum. The system, the government, the family members. No one had done anything to stop that cycle of abuse. But I did. And although my life will never be the same, I made sure that the gates of hell in that place will be closed forever. I never forgot what I saw, what I experienced. And though the rain still beats against the window, the echo of those days lingers in my mind, always reminding me that in the end, True evil doesn't always hide in the most obvious places. Sometimes the worst horror is the one disguised as the most everyday. What I learned is that sometimes evil is much closer than we imagine. The institutions we believe to be safe, the places we trust to care for our loved ones, can become battlegrounds where human life loses all value. It is our responsibility not just to watch, but to act when we know something is wrong. Indifference and fear transform us into collaborators. We cannot allow silence to be the answer to suffering. I never thought my life could change so much. I am an ordinary man, or at least I was before everything fell apart. Since I was young, I always felt different from others, not because of anything I could describe in specific terms, but because I never lived up to the stereotypes of what was expected of a man. I was told that I wasn't tough enough, that I didn't have the firm character that society seems to value so highly. My body wasn't that of an athlete, my voice didn't have that gruff tone associated with authority, and my way of thinking was calmer, more reflective. All of this somehow made me an easy target. As a kid, I didn't understand why I was so different. Why was I picked on so much for not being like the other kids? I remember how they pushed me in the hallways at school, how they made fun of me for not playing soccer like them, for not raising my voice aggressively. The first time I was humiliated, I felt a mixture of shame and anger, but I didn't know what to do with those feelings. I was not strong enough to defend myself. Over the years, the teasing became more subtle, but just as painful. The boys stopped pushing me around, but the words still resonated. You need to be more of a man. Don't be so weak. Those pants don't do you justice. You can't be so sensitive. Those phrases stuck in my mind, and I believed them for a long time. I thought that maybe something was wrong with me, that my nature was not right. I couldn't understand why I didn't feel comfortable in my own body. I felt constantly watched, always waiting for someone to judge me. There was no place for me in that world of expectations of what a man should be. Relationships weren't easy either. In fact, they were even more complicated. My girlfriends always had a form of veiled aggression, something I didn't understand right away. It would start with small criticisms, details that I thought were part of any relationship, but over time it became something more. My confidence slowly crumbled and I felt trapped. I was laughed at compared to other guys who were more masculine, stronger, and I didn't know how to react. I couldn't get out of those circles because I didn't want to be alone, and even though I knew something wasn't right, I didn't want to be left. Every word of contempt made me feel like I wasn't enough, like I wasn't worth it. In the midst of all this, I met Gabriel. At first, I thought he was a genuine friend. He was charismatic, strong, with a character that commanded respect. A few months after we met, I felt grateful for his friendship. Finally, someone I felt comfortable with, someone who seemed to see something in me. But, over time, that friendship began to turn into something darker. Gabriel started to become controlling, possessive. At first, I didn't notice it. It was an attitude disguised as concern. Why didn't you text me back? I don't like you hanging out with those people. You could use a makeover. You should look like me. Little phrases that, at first, didn't seem so serious to me. But then he started being more direct, telling me what I should do, how I should behave, what I should say. My opinions began to be ignored. I began to lose my autonomy without realizing it. The worst came when I started to feel completely unable to make decisions for myself. Every time I went out with my friends, I felt as if something was controlling me, a pressure that wouldn't let me breathe. Every time I wanted to do something, whether it was studying, watching a movie, or even deciding who to get involved with, the shadow of his influence was there. Gabriel had found a way to manipulate me. He made me feel that I was weak, that I couldn't be alone, that I needed his protection. And at some point, I began to believe it. Without realizing it, my life began to revolve around him, as if he was the center of everything. The worst thing is that I felt trapped, unable to get out of that situation, because I was afraid of being left with nothing, afraid of losing his friendship. He had shown me a way to live, but at the same time, he had locked me into his control. The first time I thought about running away was when he called me on the phone and told me I shouldn't go out with some friends he had met. Not only did he tell me not to, but he was so insistent, I felt like a frightened child. When I finally told him I would go anyway, his reaction was so intense that it scared me. He expressed to me that he wouldn't forgive me, that he would understand, that he couldn't be so irresponsible. And for the first time, I felt real fear. It was not fear that he would stop talking to me, but a much deeper fear. The fear of losing my identity. The fear that my life no longer belonged to me. In the end, I made a decision. I decided to escape his control. I knew I had to nip that friendship in the bud before it was too late. I could no longer live that way. I could no longer feel so weak. The first thing I did was to file a restraining order. It was terrifying. The moment I did it, I felt like I had ripped something out of me, something I could never get back. I was leaving behind a part of me that had been manipulated, controlled, destroyed bit by bit. But I also felt a mixture of relief. Knowing that he would no longer have influence over me gave me strength, even though I knew it would not be as easy as I had thought. As the days passed, I realized that escaping Gabriel had not been enough to heal the scars I already carried inside. Even though I didn't see him, I felt his presence, his shadow, in every corner of my life. There was a part of me that couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right decision. Was I really free? Or was I still tied to something I could no longer see? I never felt safe again. Life was not like before, and the traces of what I had lived through never disappeared. Although I tried to rebuild my life, to be the person I always wanted to be, there was always something holding me back, something that made me question my decisions. The voices from my past kept echoing. The insecurities kept lurking. But little by little, I began to understand something important. True strength is not measured by what others say, nor by what they expect of you. True strength lies in knowing when you need to stop, when you need to say enough, and take charge of your life, even when it seems impossible. Now, with time, I can say that my life is different. Although I have not been the same, I have learned something fundamental. No matter what the world says, no matter what they make you believe, you are the owner of your life, and only you can decide who you want to be. Weakness is not in being different, not in being sensitive, not in being yourself. True weakness is in letting others define who you are, in allowing them to manipulate and control you. Today, I realized that the struggle was not against Gabriel, nor against the people who humiliated me. The real fight was against my own fears and the insecurity I had carried with me for so long. I learned that strength does not always show itself in the most obvious way. Sometimes being strong is simply knowing when to let go of what hurts you and start over. True freedom, true strength, is not in what others think of you. It is in what you believe about yourself. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of storm that hits hard, as if nature itself had something to vent. I was used to those storms, but I never imagined that rain would drag me into something so dangerous. I don't know why we call it storms, if in reality, what was falling from the sky was more of a warning, an omen, something that announced to me that the worst was yet to come. And it was on that night precisely when everything changed for me. My name is Andres, and years ago I lived a quiet, almost predictable life. I had a regular job, sincere friends, and few conflicts. But as often happens in life-changing stories, you never see the change coming until you are too far into it to turn back. Eduardo had been my friend since we were kids. We knew each other too well. We had shared secrets, stories, moments of laughter, and also sadness. But no one warned us of what would happen. No one warned us that the very man I had trusted would become a shadow that haunted me. It all began when Eduardo, after years of not seeing me more than sporadically, reappeared in my life. I saw him as always, with his confident smile, that youthful glow he still maintained despite the years. But there was something in his eyes, something different. It wasn't obvious at first, but I soon knew. He was into something dangerous. Even though he tried to hide it, the small details could not escape my eyes. His changes in behavior, the long absences, the way he spoke cautiously when he mentioned certain names. I began to suspect that something was not right. One afternoon, while he was telling me one of those stories that didn't make much sense, something in his tone of voice made me realize that the Eduardo I knew was no longer the same. He had changed, but not in a physical way, but in the way he saw the world, the anguish in his gaze, the way his breathing quickened when he mentioned certain subjects. All of that left me uneasy. And as I always do, I searched for answers. But when you start looking for answers in the wrong place, that's when the darkness starts to swallow you up. That night, the storm had begun to rage with a vengeance. The rain pounded on my window panes as if it wanted to break it, and the wind made the trees buckle, snarling under the weight of the storm. As I sat on my living room couch, my phone rang. It was Eduardo, as so often before, but this time his voice was altered. I didn't fully understand, but something told me he needed to see me, that there was something important he needed to tell me. Despite the warnings my instinct was telling me, I decided to go. I took the car keys and drove to the place where he had summoned me, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The road was empty and the storm was raging more fiercely. I could barely see more than a few meters, but my mind was occupied with what Eduardo was going to tell me. Deep down, I knew something serious was brewing. And when I arrived, I confirmed it. Eduardo was waiting for me in the gloom of the warehouse. He was not alone. There were other men with him. I didn't know them, but their looks were not friendly. What struck me most, however, was the sight of the gun in Eduardo's hands. The same man who had been my lifelong friend was now armed, involved in something much darker than I imagined. I felt trapped, as if the walls of that place were slowly closing in around me. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew I had to run. Somehow, I felt that I was in danger, that all the trust I had placed in him over the years had turned into a death trap. As time went on, things got worse. Eduardo began to show me his other side. The man who had always been trustworthy, loyal, had left behind any trace of his humanity. I realized that not only was he involved in an illegal affair, but that he had become a pawn in a much larger crime network. The men he was involved with were dangerous, and the risk he was taking was greater than he thought. But the danger was not just from those men. The real danger was in the betrayal itself. Eduardo had sold his soul, and worse, he had dragged me down with him. From one moment to the next, I realized that if I wanted to survive, I had to flee, although I knew it was not going to be that simple. I was trapped, not only by the situation I was in, but by the trust I had placed in him. I felt foolish, naive, for believing that Eduardo was still the man I knew. He was not. He had changed in an irreversible way. That night, as the storm continued to unleash its fury, the tension became palpable. I found myself surrounded, with no way out, with each of those men watching suspiciously, as if they knew something I did not. Time stopped for an instant and I understood what I had to do. I ran. I ran like never before in my life. It wasn't just a matter of fear, but of survival. The sound of the rain hitting the ground was deafening and the wind seemed to be trying to drag me back, but my only thought was to escape. With my heart pounding, I ran towards the car which was parked a few meters away. My body was tense, my mind in turmoil, but there was no turning back. I knew that if I didn't escape, my life would end there, in that cold, dark warehouse, where my friend had become my enemy. The sense of betrayal was in every step I took, but the worst thing was that Eduardo, the man who had once been my friend, had stripped his own humanity for money, for power. I made it to the car. I started the engine quickly and sped off in the opposite direction, away from the place that now represented my worst nightmare. But the fear did not disappear with distance. Even though I drove for miles, I felt stalked, as if I was being followed, as if every shadow on the road was waiting to catch me. In the end, after that night, I never heard from Eduardo again. The city was filled with rumors, and the news spoke of murders, robberies, and betrayals. His face faded into the darkness, and I could only think of what I had left behind. I no longer had the ability to trust anything or anyone. Life had taught me that the greatest enemy is not always the one outside, but the one closest to you, the one you once considered a friend. Now, as I watch the rain fall hard on the empty streets, I know that my life will never be the same. I have learned that trust, while valuable, can be a deadly risk. Harm doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes, harm comes from those you trust the most. Perhaps the real lesson in all of this is that while we all have a past, sometimes it is best to let go of what we once thought was our greatest strength. Trust can be the beginning of a story, but it can also be the end of it. It was one of those endless nights, with the wind whipping at the window and the rain pounding hard on the roof. Every drop seemed to have a purpose, a mission to hammer with such intensity that I found it impossible to concentrate on anything but the storm raging outside. The sound of the rain amplified my every dark thought, as if I were trapped in an endless echo. I was trying to escape, to think of anything other than what was happening in my life, but I couldn't. My fingers drummed on the edge of the table, searching for some glimmer of calm, something that would allow me to stop thinking, if only for a second. My life, which once seemed so normal, now felt like a dungeon with no way out. The days were intertwining, all of them tinged with gray, and more I found myself trapped in my own fear, in my own condemnation. The clock on the wall read midnight, but for me, the hours no longer made sense. Every minute was getting painfully longer. The silence of the night was only interrupted by the roar of the storm and the distant echoes of my own anxiety. It had all started months ago, in such an insignificant way that I never imagined it would change my life forever. My name is Sebastian, but lately I have begun to wonder if that name has any meaning for me. Who am I now? I feel strange, alien to myself. The person I once was no longer exists. It all started with something so simple, so trivial. A lie. It was a small lie, born out of fear, out of insecurity. A lie I decided to tell someone in a moment of weakness. I never thought it would be so easy to let myself go, that this lie would cost me so much. At first, everything seemed fine. No one seemed to notice anything. My life went on, and I continued with my daily routines, my work, my friends, my dreams. But the lie was growing, taking shape, becoming something much bigger than I could handle. No one warned me, no one told me it would be like this. My own fear, my inability to face the truth, dragged me down. It was a foolish mistake, one I made thinking nothing bad could happen. But when you give in to temptation, to the desire to be accepted, the price you pay is much higher than you imagine. Guilt began to settle in my life like a shadow, growing day by day. It was like an invisible weight that was getting heavier and heavier with time, and worst of all, I couldn't escape it. I couldn't look anyone in the eye. My friends, my classmates, they all seemed to notice it, although they never said anything. I could see their fleeting glances, their discomfort when they passed me. Everything had changed, but I didn't know how to explain what had happened, how I had gotten to this point. Isolation was inevitable. More and more I felt alienated from everyone around me. My coworkers drifted away, my friends turned their backs on me. It was as if an invisible barrier had been erected between us, something I had built with my own hands. Every conversation seemed to be an empty performance, and every day I felt more alone, more lost in my own chaos. But the worst was yet to come. I wasn't just sinking into guilt. Someone who knew what I had done, began to stalk me. First it was little messages, vague hints. They didn't speak directly to me about what I had done, but the words were clear enough for me to understand that someone was aware of everything. At first I thought it was a joke, a game, something unimportant. I didn't want to take it seriously, but each message became more frightening, more direct. They knew more than I thought. They knew exactly what I had done. Fear began to seep into my bones. I felt watched at every turn. Every corner of my house, every shadow that lengthened in the darkness of the night seemed to hide something that stalked me. My mind began to play tricks on me. Every sound, no matter how insignificant, seemed like a threat. The wind was hitting the windows hard, and in the roar of the storm, I seemed to hear footsteps, whispers that made me turn quickly to the door, hoping to find someone there. But there was never anyone. The messages kept coming. It was no longer a simple text message. There were pictures, details, things that only someone watching me closely could know. My anxiety grew at a rapid pace. The storm outside my house didn't seem as frightening as the storm raging inside my mind. Every night was a never-ending nightmare. I felt trapped in a cycle from which I could not escape. I was being chased, but I didn't know by whom or how. All I knew was that I could not run away. My home, my refuge, was no longer a safe place. I tried to seek solace in what used to be my life. I tried to return to my old habits, but everything felt empty. My friends were gone. Guilt dragged me down, and fear kept me up all night. More and more I felt trapped, surrounded by a presence I never saw, but knew was there. The doors were closed, the windows were closed, but the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows would not go away. The isolation was total. I could not leave my house. The simple act of opening the door and going out into the world seemed like a condemnation. If I was under surveillance, any false move could mean my ruin. The city outside my windows seemed as distant as if it didn't exist, as if only the storm remained and I, a prisoner of my own guilt. The rain began to ease, but the pressure in my chest would not relent. The wind was still whipping furiously, and the storm was rising in my mind. Every corner of the house, every familiar object, seemed to be watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. It was no longer just guilt that plagued me. It was fear, the constant fear that the truth would come out, that my mistakes would be discovered. No one saw me, but everyone knew. The hours passed in a blur, but the truth became more and more obvious. I was trapped. No one would come to my rescue. There was no way to escape the net I had gotten myself into. My life, once full of promise, had fallen apart because of a lie that seemed so harmless at first. But like everything in life, what seems insignificant at first can turn into a monster that devours everything around you. Eventually, the storm calmed, and the rain stopped. But there was no relief. What I had done could not be undone, and what had crumbled could no longer be rebuilt. In the end, the damage was done. And worst of all, it had been me who had allowed it. I had allowed lies, fear, and guilt to dominate me to this point. The storm outside passed, but the traces of what I had done remained, deep and indelible. Sometimes we are unaware of what we are creating with our decisions. Sometimes we seek the acceptance of others and are driven by fear to face our own truth. But the truth, as scary as it is, always comes out. And when it does, there is no escaping the consequences. In the end, we are responsible for what we have done, and the storms we bring with our decisions will follow us to the end. It was one of those nights when time seems to stand still, when the heavy, humid air merges with the feeling of oppression that accompanies you at every step. The wind whipped the windows of my apartment with such violence that, at times, I thought the storm would sweep away everything in its path. The rain was hitting the glass with force, as if it wanted to break the barrier that separated it from the outside world. I, sitting in the darkness, watched the drops slide on the glass, unable to look away. Every blow of the storm seemed to multiply the noise echoing in my mind. Every thought, every memory overflowing from my consciousness. My name is Jorman. A year ago, I was living a quiet life, with a stable job, and the feeling that everything was under control. Like any ordinary person, I felt at peace with my surroundings. I always considered myself honest, a person of principle, who stood by his values and was not afraid to tell the truth, even if it was uncomfortable. That, apparently, was my biggest mistake. The nightmare began quietly, without warning. One simple misstep, one bad decision, and my life fell apart. It was just a small error in judgment, something that seemed unimportant at the time, but which, over time, led me down a dark path from which I could not return. It was a lie, something I accepted because I was convinced it was for the best. I got caught up in a corrupt system, one that manipulated everything around it without me noticing. At first, it was just a small assignment, something without repercussions. But the decisions we make carry weight, and I soon realized that I had entered a dangerous game where there is no way out. By the time I wanted to turn back, it was too late. They, the organization, had marked me. They knew everything about me. They knew my weaknesses, my fears. There was no way to undo what I had done. I thought I could disappear, that I could escape their influence, but I didn't. That's when the persecution began. One day when I got home, I found my apartment in disarray. No one left me a message, not a clue, but I knew it was the beginning of something that would change my life forever. I didn't understand why I had been chosen, or what exactly I had done to deserve this. But what I did know was that I was no longer safe. Something had awakened in them, an unstoppable force that would haunt me until the end. I didn't know who was behind it all, but I felt their presence constantly. With every step I took, the threat seemed to get closer. I could no longer trust anything or anyone. The shadows of the night were no longer just darkness. They were echoes of what was stalking me, what was following me. The storm outside intensified even more. The wind intertwined with the sound of the rain, creating a deafening noise that seemed to reflect the chaos in my mind. I was trying to think clearly, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could not. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of my apartment in disarray. The feeling that someone had been there watching me. I couldn't stop thinking about the times I felt like I was being followed. Of the people who stared at me for too long. Of the times when the streets seemed empty, but I knew I wasn't alone. My job, which had once been my refuge, became a battlefield. Every conversation, every exchange with my coworkers became more tense. I felt that something wasn't right, that each of them was hiding something. Sometimes, I would find myself looking at people and thinking if any of them knew what was going on, if any of them were part of the network that was chasing me. But no one said anything. They all seemed oblivious to what was happening, as if it was a problem that did not concern them. Worst of all, even though I felt constantly watched, there was nothing I could do about it. Going out into the street was even worse. Every face, every look, was a possible threat. I felt I could not escape. The pressure began to get to me. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I was losing control of my own mind. Fear had taken hold of me, but what terrified me more was that I didn't know when or how it would reach me. I could feel it in the air, in the lonely streets I walked, in the sounds that faded into the darkness. There was nowhere I could hide, no shelter. The feeling of being surrounded intensified with each passing day. The rain was relentless, and I, in my small apartment, was trapped in an endless nightmare. The nights were the worst. When darkness fell, I felt the pressure of vigilance upon me. In my mind, the footsteps I heard in the hallway, the lights flickering in the street, were not coincidences. I felt that someone was waiting for the perfect moment to catch me, to give me the final blow. The walls of my apartment, which used to provide me with security, became a prison. I looked out the window, watching the storm ravage the city, but I couldn't get out. I couldn't escape. Why was I being chased? What had I really done to deserve this? That question, which I had not asked myself before, began to hammer in my head relentlessly. As the months passed, the pursuit intensified. Every time I approached a subway station, it seemed to me that the people around me were watching me suspiciously. Passing cars seemed to follow my route, and every step I took on the street seemed to be a step into the abyss. The stares were becoming colder, more calculating, and although I couldn't identify who was behind it all, I knew it wasn't something I could ignore any longer. My life, as I understood it, was over. One day, after several sleepless nights, I decided to leave. I could not stay in that state. My mind, exhausted by constant fear, could no longer function properly. I made an impulsive decision, without thinking about the consequences. I went to the train station, blended in with the crowd, and ran to the first car. There was no plan, no destination, just a desperate need to escape. I sat on the train, looking out the window, watching the lights of the city fade behind me. But even on that train, I felt something following me. Every movement, every face, seemed like a threat, until suddenly a man looked at me piercingly. I didn't know him, but there was something in his gaze that chilled my blood. The train continued on its way, but that look stayed with me, like an omen. Days, weeks passed, and my life became a constant flight, a game of survival where I didn't know who was the hunter and who was the prey. My face had been erased. My name no longer had meaning. Only a man remained, a man pursued by something I did not understand, by someone I never knew who he was. The streets were no longer a refuge. People were no longer friends. No one could save me, not even myself. Now, watching the storm from my window, I realize that no matter how many times I try to run, I will always be trapped in the web I myself helped weave. This life, once mine, has been taken away. I cannot escape, because the real prison is not in the bars, but in the choices we make. The shadows that follow me are my own guilt, my own denial, and all that remains is the storm, which continues to lash, relentless. The rain pounded the windows with relentless force, as if it wanted to wash everything away. The sound of the water pouring down on the roof of my small apartment seemed to amplify the echoes of my own thoughts. My name is Lucas, and what seemed to be a quiet, uneventful life had turned into a never-ending nightmare. I'm not sure at what point it all started to fall apart, or how I got here, but now, every minute feels like a race to survive. I'm an average student, one who would rather be in his room, reading or doing homework at college, with no other worries than exams. But even though that was the life I always imagined for myself, something changed. Something that started so subtly, so insignificantly, that I never imagined it would end up changing my existence forever. Now, with each passing day, I feel the pressure mounting, the fear infiltrating every corner of my being. Exactly 2 weeks ago, something in my life changed forever. There were no signs, no premonitions, just an ordinary day, like any other. At the university, as always, everything seemed normal. The halls were full of students. The professors were talking about subjects that didn't mean much to me. But that afternoon, on my way back to my apartment, it all started. I received a message. It was not out of the ordinary. In fact, most of my friends sent me trivial messages all the time, talking about homework, teachers, or plans for the weekend. But this message was different. It contained no text, no pictures, just a picture of me, taken from my apartment window. It was not a recent photo, but one that had clearly been taken some time ago, perhaps days or weeks ago. There was no indication of who had sent it or why it had been addressed to me. Fear came over me immediately, though I tried to remain calm. I thought it might be a prank, some kind of macabre game. But when the message was repeated the next day and the next, the truth hit me hard. Something was not right. I tried to look for a logical explanation. Could it be someone from the past, an acquaintance, someone I'd had a problem with in college or on the street? But there were no answers. My friends were as confused as I was, and each of them suggested that I shouldn't worry too much. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone unknown, was watching me, and not in a casual way, but with a clear intention, something much more sinister. The rain was still coming down hard that night, making the sounds from outside amplified in my empty apartment. I sat on the couch, staring at the screen of my phone. I couldn't stop thinking about the message, about the photo. What did it mean? Who was behind it all? As the days went by, the threats started coming more frequently. Pictures of me in different places, some of them taken when I wasn't even aware of this person's presence. It was clear that I was constantly being watched, but why? What did they want from me? Fear became a constant. The halls of the university, once filled with laughter and conversation, now seemed empty to me. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Every glance, every misstep I took felt like someone was watching. It was as if the air around me was getting thicker, as if the walls were slowly closing in on me. I couldn't escape the feeling. The fear was palpable, a constant pressure on my chest that wouldn't let me breathe. I remember that night in particular. I was at home, all alone. The city lights were shining dimly through the rain-fogged window, and the wind was howling loudly. I was sitting on the couch staring at my phone when I received a new message. It wasn't a picture this time, but a short text. "I'm looking at you." The sentence was accompanied by a picture of the building I lived in, taken from the street, right in front of my window. I felt trapped, like an insect in a spider's web. I couldn't stop thinking about the implications of those words. Who was watching me? What did they want from me? The next few days were a torment. At first, I tried not to make a big deal out of it, convinced that someone was just playing with me. But it didn't take me long to realize that there was nothing innocent about this game. The threat was real. With each passing day, the signs became clearer, the photos closer, the locations more precise. It was no longer just the phone, but I began to feel a presence behind me. At the university, in the supermarket, in the street. I knew someone was watching me, but I didn't know who. Desperate, I tried to tell the police, but they didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. They looked at me as if I was overreacting. Maybe they thought I was looking for attention, or that it was just a bad joke. But the fear I felt was real. Every corner of my life was being affected, and I couldn't live in constant fear. I was trapped in a cycle of paranoia, but worst of all, I couldn't trust anyone. The people I knew no longer seemed to be the same. Those I once considered friends became strangers, and although some tried to comfort me, the truth was that anxiety had completely consumed me. In the end, the only option left to me was to find out who was behind it all. I had to know the truth. I was tired of living in fear, of feeling that every step could be my last. Every time I received a message, every time I saw that terrifying photo, my mind was filled with questions. Why did they choose me? What did they want from me? And most importantly, what would they do when they finally found me? That's when I started doing something I never imagined I would do: investigate. Every clue I picked up led me to a dead end, but I kept moving. I took refuge in the small details, the strange gestures of the people on the streets, the fleeting glances they gave me, the sound of the wind in the night. I felt I was getting closer to the truth, though the answer eluded me again and again. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't stop. I couldn't give up. The storm outside my window continued, a constant reminder of the despair that was overtaking me. The days passed slowly, and my mind seemed to be on the verge of collapse. Every sound, every step made me jump, but I could never find the answer. No one else was seeing what I was seeing, and my paranoia was deepening. In the end, I discovered something I never imagined. The aggressor, the stalker, was not a single person, but a network. The organization I belonged to, The network that had been watching me was no mere coincidence. They had been controlling my life from the moment I made a mistake. That mistake, so small at first, had caused a chain reaction that had dragged me into a world I couldn't get out of. They were not after money or revenge, but something far more dangerous: absolute power over each of us. Today, as the rain continues to lash against my window, I realize there is no escape. No matter how many times I try to run away, the control will always be there, lurking from the shadows. The real lesson is that our lives can be manipulated by others without us even realizing it, and by the time we realize it, it is too late. We live in the shadows, and the price for our freedom is higher than we imagine. The rain lashed the small hut with relentless fury. Every drop that crashed against the windows seemed to echo like a distant echo of the horrors I had lived through. The storm outside was but a reflection of the one that still lingered in my mind, a storm that consumed me and would not let me rest. My hands were shaking as I held a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, and although the warmth of the drink was fading, the cold feeling inside me did not disappear. Precisely 1 year ago, I decided to make a choice that would transform my life for good. I decided to take a solo trip to the rainforest, a place so vast, so primitive, that the very idea of losing myself among its trees seemed like the cure for my empty life. I wanted to disconnect from everything, to escape the monotony, to find peace in the solitude of nature. The jungle promised me the stillness I so desperately needed, but I didn't know that within it also lurked monsters. No, not monsters of flesh and blood, but something much worse: men who feed on the suffering of others. My journey began quietly. I headed into the heart of the jungle, far from civilization, with only the essentials in my backpack. What I never imagined was that the place I had chosen to find calm would become my worst nightmare. The jungle enveloped me with its thickness, its humidity, the distant chirping of wild creatures, and the crunching of leaves under my feet. As I went deeper into the forest, the air became thicker, the humidity more oppressive. The sounds of nature were constant, but I had no sense of being alone, and that made me uneasy. On the third day of my journey, a change in the atmosphere alerted me. The air became thick and heavy, almost suffocating, as if the jungle itself was watching me, waiting for something. I was walking along a narrow path, covered by branches and fallen leaves, when suddenly, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Human footprints in the mud, fresh, recent. My instinct whispered that I should go in the opposite direction, but curiosity got the better of me. Who else could be there, so deep in the jungle? Maybe someone lost like me, someone who could provide me with answers. Without thinking twice, I made the wrong decision. I followed the tracks. The tracks seemed abandoned at first, but as I moved forward, I realized that they became more recent, closer. My breathing began to quicken, and a knot in my stomach grew tighter and tighter. Something in the air, something on the ground, told me that I should not continue, but it was too late. My feet followed the trail as if they were being dragged by an invisible force. Finally, I found them. 3 men, covered in mud, their faces indecipherable, as if the jungle had transformed them, made them part of its own landscape. They looked at me with a terrifying calm, as if they were evaluating me, waiting to see what I would do. They said nothing, but their silence was heavier than any words. I didn't know if they were friend or foe, and the uncertainty paralyzed me. I was not prepared for what followed. The men didn't speak to me. There were no explanations, just a sudden movement that left me breathless. One of them slowly approached and pointed a finger at me, indicating that I should follow them. I could do nothing. I tried to resist, to scream, but there was no time. In an instant, they had surrounded me. They dragged me through the jungle, without my understanding the reason for their action. My every attempt to free myself was futile. My backpacks, my gear, everything I had brought with me was left behind, abandoned on the ground as they carried me towards a makeshift camp. And there, in that dank darkness, the real hell began. It wasn't the physical pain that tormented me the most, but the uncertainty, the confusion, the fear. The first day was the quietest, but also the most intense. I was kept tied up, without food, without water, and I was thrown into absolute isolation. The sound of the jungle, which had been so comforting before, now seemed unbearable. The roar of nocturnal animals, the distant chirping of birds, the pattering of rain on leaves, all became a reminder of my vulnerability. Hours passed, then days. My body was weakening, and my mind was beginning to fracture. I didn't know what they wanted from me. I didn't understand why they had captured me. But I knew eventually, it wasn't money they were after. It wasn't loot or a reward. They just wanted something else, to see how far a person could be broken, how far they could shatter the human soul before life itself was a matter of endurance. The three men watched me, without saying a word, with eyes that showed not a hint of empathy. They understood suffering in a way that I could never understand. Every night, I was left alone in the middle of the jungle, and the darkness grew thicker and thicker. I could no longer distinguish the boundaries between reality and nightmare. My mind began to give way, but desperation kept me going. The torture was not only physical, but psychological. The hunger, the thirst, the waiting, the anguish of not knowing if at dawn I would be alive or dead. My body no longer responded as before. My legs had become heavy. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. The sun no longer meant hope, just another shadow in my daily torture. But the worst moment came when they began to change their attitude. They became more active, closer. One of them touched me, a cold, rough hand on my skin, and that was enough to make my mind overflow. Despair made me lose my mind for a few minutes. I didn't know if my life had any meaning beyond what I was living. I no longer knew who I was or why I was there. 5 days passed before I found an opportunity. Fear and anger pushed me to one last effort. I managed to free myself from the ropes that held me prisoner. My mind was overflowing with adrenaline, but something inside me knew that this was my only chance. I ran without looking back. I ran deeper into the jungle aimlessly, with only a desperate drive to save my life. I ran for hours, without rest, until the jungle began to clear a little. The trees gave way to a small village. No one knew me. No one asked me where I came from, but I knew the nightmare was not over. That encounter, that suffering, had marked me in such a way that I could no longer be the same person. My life would no longer be the same. As the days passed, I realized that not only had my freedom been taken from me, my peace had been taken away. My soul was broken, fragmented by the experience I had lived through. I could no longer find solace in nature, nor in solitude. The jungle had left its mark on me, not only on my body, but on my deepest being. Even today, as the storm hits the window, I feel that the jungle has not left me. The peace I was looking for never existed. The jungle, those men, the decisions I made taught me a terrifying lesson. Curiosity can be a poison, and some decisions are irreversible. Life is not always fair, and sometimes the strength to survive is not enough to heal what destroys us. Now, as I watch the rain fall hard, I realize that the jungle never let me go, and maybe it never will. My name is Jesus Alfredo. What many of those who saw me passing by on the street, staring at the ground, or those who passed me on the sidewalk did not know, is that my life was not like theirs. No, they did not understand what it was like to be trapped inside your own mind, in a prison of thoughts that do not belong to you, but that control you as if your life were a simple toy that gradually falls apart. The disease inside me, the one that haunts me, is not visible. It is a shadow that accompanies me every day, every minute. It has no face, no body. It is just there, waiting, lurking in every corner of my mind, ready to pounce on me when I least expect it. Over the years, I have learned to hide it as best I could. At first, it was just a distant murmur, a strange feeling in my chest, something I could ignore. But over time it became stronger, more present. It is no longer just a part of me. It's my shadow, my constant haunting. No one knows it, of course. No one except me. And that's why they call me crazy, and that's why they avoid me, because no one wants to see what I really am. The storm pounding on the windows of my apartment is nothing compared to the storm raging in my head. The wind sounds like it's going to tear down the walls, but I know that what's really tearing me down are the internal screams, the voices that tell me I'm not enough, that I never will be. My illness, that invisible thing that inhabits me, has made me a lonely man. My friends turned their backs on me long ago, my relatives look at me with pity, and worst of all, I have come to believe what they say about me. I've been stigmatized, I've been left out, and I feel trapped in a cycle I can't escape. And now, as if that wasn't bad enough, I feel my world starting to completely collapse. Days ago, something changed. Something I can't explain. Something that makes me feel like I can't trust anyone anymore. I live in a quiet neighborhood, far from the city, where everything seems to be routine, where everything seems to be under control. But appearances are treacherous. Something is moving in the shadows. It is not a noise that can be easily identified. It's not a rustling in the walls or a distant whisper. It is something worse, something watching me. The other day, when I went out to buy bread, I noticed someone following me. It was a tall man, wearing a dark jacket, his hood pulled tight. I thought it was just my mind, that my paranoia was taking over, but it wasn't. Not this time. The feeling of being watched intensified as I made my way down the sidewalk, as if my breathing became heavier and the air thicker. I reached the store quickly, my heart in my throat, and hurried to pay. When I came out, that feeling didn't go away. The man was there, standing on the street corner, barely visible under the dim light of a broken street lamp. I decided not to look back. I knew the worst thing I could do was show fear, but I couldn't help it. I was terrified. Something in me told me I shouldn't let that man follow me. When I got to my building, I ran up the stairs, as if I could escape everything that was looming over me. But I didn't. He found me. That night, the storm was raging. The rain was pounding on the window panes and the wind was coming through the cracks, furious. Everyone was in their homes, taking shelter, but I couldn't stop staring at the door. Something told me I shouldn't sleep that night. Something kept me alert. In the silence, barely interrupted by the sound of the rain, I thought I heard footsteps. Cautious, as if someone was hovering at my door, waiting for the right moment to enter. Fear paralyzed me, but I couldn't let it make me look vulnerable. I got out of bed, crouching down, trying to make as little noise as possible. I looked out the window, hoping to see some indication that all this wasn't real, but the darkness and rain prevented me from seeing anything beyond a few feet. The clock on the wall was ticking, but I felt that time had stopped. My breathing was quickening, and for a moment, I didn't know if the pounding I heard was coming from outside or from my own mind. Was it him? Was he inside my head? The door to my apartment was locked. I knew it. I had checked it 1,000 times before going to sleep, but now it seemed useless. Fear was bigger than any physical barrier, and while the rain pounded like a constant threat, the sound of those footsteps kept echoing in my mind. I didn't see him enter, but I felt his presence. Sometime that night, the door gave way, and when I realized it, he was already there. I didn't see him clearly, but I could feel him. It was as if the air around him was thick, heavy, charged with a dark energy. I felt trapped with no way out, and his presence invaded me like a poison. I don't know how much time passed. I don't know if it was minutes or hours, but somehow I managed to escape. I ran down the hallway, not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do. The rain, always the rain, seemed to be my only refuge, the only sound that accompanied me as I tried to run away from something I didn't understand. But he was there, always present, always lurking. And now, here I am, in this apartment, trapped in the dark, with the rain pounding incessantly on the windows, and the terror of not knowing if I'm being chased by a real man or by the shadow that dwells in my mind. The storm outside is nothing compared to what I carry inside. Sometimes I wonder if I will ever be able to break out of this cycle of fear, if I will ever be free of my own mind, of the demons that torment me. I realize then that everything I have lived through so far is only a reflection of my own despair. The illness that consumes me, the loneliness, the fear, all of that has been fueled by my own thoughts, by the way I have let myself be dragged into the darkness. I have been my own jailer, my own enemy. And though I try to fight, though I try to find a way out, I know that the storm inside me will not stop. It never will. The reflection is clear. Some shadows are invisible, and some prisons are within ourselves. The fight is never against others, but against what we carry inside. And sometimes, the real monsters are not outside, but in our own minds. The rain has started again. The sound of the drops hitting the window, the rhythmic clatter that seems to want to break the glass, drags me back to that state of wakefulness, to that palpable tension in the air that makes everything else fade away. I am alone, and yet I am not. The walls of my house, which once offered me solace, are now prisons that hold me back. Raindrops, as incessant as the thoughts that won't leave me, surround me. My breath mingles with the wind, the ambient wail that cries out as if everything is about to collapse. I sit in the corner of the room, hands clasped on my knees. My legs feel weak, as if the weight of what has happened is crushing me with each passing minute. And yet there is no rest. My mind won't allow me to find peace. Echoes of the past return again and again, pounding like drops beating on the window. I remember the first time I heard that voice, the same one that now, unceasingly, hammers me. My eyes look through the fogged window, but I see nothing but shadows. Sometimes I think that these shadows are the same ones that have followed me throughout my life, that feed on my fears, my insecurities, my pain. I used to think that time would do its job, that the scars would disappear. But time does not take away the scars of the soul. On the contrary, it makes them deeper, as if all the suffering will remain embedded in the bones, engraved in the skin. And there it remains, waiting, lurking. It just needs the storm to come to remind me of what I am, what I was. The rain is so heavy now that it feels like the roof might collapse under its weight. The oppressive feeling in the air makes me feel more vulnerable. Outside, the streets seem submerged in a dense fog, almost as if the world itself is about to drown. I feel like I'm drowning too, more and more every day. I try not to think about it. I try not to let the fear consume me, but it's no use. The worst thing is not the storm outside. The worst thing is the storm inside me. When did it all start? Maybe I will never know. Maybe it was always there, waiting for the right moment to overflow, to consume everything it touched. The first signs were subtle. I got the message. A simple text, an unknown number, a reminder of something I tried to forget. My childhood photo, the image of my mother, the one that left me without a word, without a goodbye, just an emptiness. Then came more. Messages that shook me, that trapped me in a web of memories and fears I thought I had overcome. But the past never goes away completely. It just waits patiently, crouching in the shadows, until you least expect it, until you no longer have the strength to fight it. At first I thought it was paranoia. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't escape. The images kept coming. Voices seemed to whisper from everywhere. People I thought had forgotten me, people I thought were gone from my life, suddenly reappeared. Not physically, not in a tangible way, but their presences, their looks, their movements, were always around me, as if the threads of the past were tied to my wrists, and I could not free myself from them. My life began to slowly fall apart. People looked at me differently. At first I couldn't understand why. I didn't know if it was my own eyes betraying me, or if something in the air had really changed. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. I could no longer walk down the street without feeling that something was stalking me from the shadows. The whispers, the furtive glances, the muffled laughter behind my back, it all piled up. Anxiety was choking me, consuming me bit by bit, as if I could no longer be free. As if the whole world was a stage where everyone was waiting for me to make a mistake. And in that mistake, the past would become flesh, rise up before me, and crush me. And then, just when I thought I could fall no lower, the unexpected happened. It was a direct hit. My best friend disappeared. I didn't understand it at first. It was so sudden, so disconcerting. A missed call, a message I couldn't read. By the time I tried to find him, it was too late. The police did nothing. No one seemed to care. The void he left in my life was so deep it took my breath away. Not only because of his absence, but because of the fear that grew in me. What had happened? Why had I lost him? No one knew anything, and I began to realize that the only one who knew of the connection we had, the only one who knew my secrets, was watching, waiting. And worse, he knew of my vulnerability. He knew how to manipulate my fears, how to pull me out of my own center. Meanwhile, the echo of the past kept pounding in my mind, and the shadows, now more palpable than ever, seemed to move around me. Who was behind all this? I asked myself over and over again, without getting an answer. Every corner felt like a threat. Every step I took, I felt the pressure of being watched. It was as if I was caught in a net that I couldn't see, but I knew was there. And he wasn't just being chased by a single person. Something bigger, something darker was unfolding, something that was pushing me to my limits. And I realized something I didn't want to accept. I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a product of my broken mind. The tension grew even more when the calls began. Distorted voices, whispers in the dark. Nothing clear was ever said to me, just vague questions, innuendos, comments about what I had done, what I had experienced. The same voice that had haunted me in my thoughts. The same one that had been there since my childhood, when my mother left and my father abandoned me to his own drift. The same one that now, lurking, had dragged me back into the abyss. The rain intensified. The wind blew furiously, as if the sky itself wanted to swallow me up. Why couldn't I escape all this? Fear had infiltrated every part of me, and now the shadows seemed darker, closer, as if waiting for me to make a mistake. As if my life, everything I had tried to build, was about to crumble before my eyes. But here I am, alone, trapped in my own mind, with the storm rumbling around me, waiting for the last vestige of my sanity to shatter completely. All I can do now is resist. I cannot escape. The past is too close, and the shadows that haunt me won't let me flee. Fear, which I once felt from afar, is now my constant companion. But I still have something left, the ability to fight. Even if the storm continues to rage and the shadows grow longer, I can still decide not to be defeated. The past is not erased, and the darkness is not always in sight. Sometimes, the scariest shadows are the ones we carry inside. But what matters is not how the pain marked us, but how we choose to face that darkness. And I, though I don't know if I will ever stop feeling it, have made a decision. I will not let it consume me. I will not give in. Even in the fiercest storm, even in the worst darkness, I will fight on. I cannot sleep. The rain lashes against the windows, and the sound of the drops hitting the glass seems to increase with each passing minute. It's as if the world is about to fall apart, as if all the tension I've been feeling inside me is seeping outside, through the storm. The darkness outside the window mixes with the humidity, creating a thick atmosphere that chokes me. But it's not just the thunder or the storm that unsettles me. It's what's going on in my head, what's hiding in the shadows of my past, what won't let me rest. My name is Manuel, and a year ago I made a mistake that ruined my life. A mistake that I cannot erase. Not a trivial mistake. Not a common mistake. No. What I did was irreversible. And worst of all, I couldn't even fully redeem myself. That opportunity slipped through my fingers, like rain that slips through the window and is lost in the darkness. The case started with a phone call that changed everything. I was accused of a crime I didn't commit, of something I couldn't even imagine. I was told I was guilty of a murder, the one that had been committed in a nearby neighborhood. No one understood it. No one believed it could be true. Not even me. But the evidence was against me, and no matter how hard I tried to explain, they wouldn't listen. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare from which I could not wake up. And even though the police had no conclusive evidence, I was dragged into a system that offered no way out. The night I was arrested was the first time I heard the rain pounding with such fury, as if it was also crying for me. At that moment, I realized that everything I knew had fallen apart. People began to look at me differently, even those who had called me friend. Everyone, from my family members to strangers, began to turn away from me. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to help. The fear of being wrong, or worse, being labeled as an accomplice, made them shut up. Society has that cruel way of looking at you when you fall from its grace, and I fell without a chance of defense. Months passed in which I struggled with desperation. No one understood what I felt, not even myself. One day, after a long wait and several failed attempts to prove my innocence, the authorities finally decided to release me, but not because they believed me innocent. No, they set me free because they did not have enough evidence to convict me. However, the mark of guilt remained on me, and no one in town thought I was innocent. That was the worst thing. The trial had been like a shadow that would haunt me forever. However, that was not the end of my ordeal. People began to wonder what had happened to the real culprit, and I felt as if I was marked by a fate I did not choose. There was something else behind it all, something moving in the shadows that I didn't understand. But as time went on, the nightmare did not end. On the contrary, it got worse. A few days after my release, strange things began to happen. I received anonymous letters that spoke of my secrets, of the mistakes I had made in the past. They were so detailed that I felt as if someone was watching every step I took. It wasn't subtle, no. They were threats, warnings from someone who was stalking me, from someone who knew too much about me. The same fear I felt when I was arrested began to take over my mind again. But this time, it wasn't the system that was after me. It was something else, something darker. I realized that the mistake I had made in the past, something so personal that I had tried to erase, was being used against me. That mistake, which still weighed heavy on my soul, was becoming my worst enemy. And somehow, someone knew every single detail. Who could it be? Was it a coincidence? Or was someone manipulating me from the shadows? The letters became more explicit. They began to describe my life in terms that only a close observer could know. Every corner of my home, every place I frequented, every thought that haunted me, seemed to be known to that person. I felt like a trapped animal, with no way out. I began to fear for my life. The feeling of being chased was not just figurative. Something in my instinct told me that someone was watching me, that this person knew my steps before I took them. One night, as the rain came down harder than ever, the fear reached its peak. I left my house, desperate for answers. I wanted to know who was behind it all, who wanted to destroy me, who was manipulating my life in this cruel way. The noise of the storm enveloped me, but even amidst the fury of the rain, I heard something strange, a rustling sound, as if someone was walking behind me. I stopped in my tracks but saw no one. However, the feeling that I wasn't alone was so overwhelming that I couldn't help but panic. I ran looking for shelter, something to protect me from that incessant feeling. I didn't know if what I felt was paranoia or if there really was someone following me. But the sense of danger was palpable. The rain kept falling as if the whole world was at war with itself. The night was getting darker, as if I was being devoured by shadows. Finally, I came to a dark alley, the last place I could escape to. I don't know how, but there, I found what I was looking for. A clue. On the ground, among the dirt and wet leaves, was an envelope. The same kind of envelope I had received before. I took it with trembling hands, and when I opened it, what I found inside chilled my blood. A photo from my childhood. The same photo I had lost years ago, when I tried to forget what I had done. The same photo that, at that moment, reminded me that I could not escape, no matter how far I ran. My past would always come back to claim me. And then, I understood. The person who was chasing me was not a stranger. He wasn't a serial killer or a mysterious figure. It was someone who knew my mistake, someone I had failed in the past, someone with a deep grudge, someone who had been watching me all along, waiting for the right moment to make me pay. My life was not just a victim of justice. I was a victim of my own past. Now, here I am, in this dark room, with the rain lashing the glass, with the echo of my own fears ringing in my ears. My name is Manuel, and I have learned a very hard lesson. The past never lets us go. No matter how far we try to escape, no matter what we do to change. There are mistakes that define us, mistakes that become shadows that haunt us, that lurk in the dark, waiting for the right moment to come to light. Today, I can't escape. But maybe that's not what's important. What really matters is what I do now. The reflection is simple. We are not the actions of our past. We are not the shadows that haunt us. We are the choices we make today, in this moment. The choices that define who we are and how we face the darkness. And it is in the darkness that we truly discover who we are. The rain beats furiously against the windows, a curtain of water that seems to want to wash away everything in its path. I can't help but hear it, although the truth is I don't even know if it's closer or farther away. The drops fall incessantly, an enveloping sound, a constant murmur that mixes with the beating of my own heart. The air in the room is thick, almost heavy, as if the atmosphere itself is charged with something I cannot touch. It's warm, but everything feels cold to me. Everything but my thoughts. They're still burning, trapped in a spiral of terror, hatred, and confusion. My name is Daniel. At 38 years old, I am blind. Darkness is my only world since an accident, years ago, robbed me of my sight. Some would say that living without sight is a torment, but the truth is that over time, you learn to live with it. The lack of sight is compensated for by the other senses. Hearing sharpens, touch becomes more precise. But what I never imagined is that those same senses would be the ones that would save my life and, at the same time, drag me into madness. It all started one night, like so many others. I was at home, in my first-floor apartment, listening to the storm from the safety of my walls. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the sound of the rain hitting the glass hard, the wind screeching through the cracks in the window. The quiet of the night surrounded me, until something changed. The sound was barely audible at first, a faint rustle, as if someone had taken a step on the wet sidewalk. My ears strained, concentrating. In my world, sounds have a different texture. They are sharper, closer. The rustle of branches moving in the wind, footsteps in the street, my breathing sometimes, as if it's the only thing I can control. And that night, there was one more sound, one I'd never heard before in my life. A whisper, a strange, subtle noise, as if someone was there inside my house watching me. I got up from the armchair I was sitting on, carefully, feeling the space around me. My hands touched the walls, recognizing the familiar contours, but something felt different. The atmosphere was charged with a palpable tension, as if waiting for something to happen. And then I heard it. A distinct noise, a dull thud. Something heavy was falling to the floor. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I wasn't alone. There was no way someone had come in without me hearing it. But the sound was there. I was sure someone was in my house. My heart began to beat faster. The noises in the house became clearer. Footsteps. Slow. Calculated. I could hear them approaching me. And then silence. Absolute silence. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything. I didn't want to move, but I knew that if I didn't, all would be lost. So, very cautiously, I made my way to the kitchen. The wooden floor creaked under my feet, but I didn't care. There was no time to be stealthy. The breath in my ear was the only thing I heard before something hit me with brutal force. Pain spread through my body, but what scared me the most was the sound. A dull, violent sound, as if someone had hit me with a heavy object. My face slammed into something cold and hard. My nose started to bleed, but the worst thing was not that. The worst thing was that I could no longer hear anything, just the rumbling of the storm. I was alone, no vision, no sound, and the darkness was my only company. I don't know how much time passed, but when I finally managed to regain consciousness, I realized that something had changed. I was bleeding, my whole body hurt, and the ground was wet, not from the rain, but from something else, something I couldn't immediately identify. But the smell was unmistakable. Blood. The blood of someone who had been near me, someone who had fallen. And there I was, in the middle of the darkness, unable to see, but with the feeling of that person's presence stalking me. My mind began to process. What if that person had attacked me for some reason? What if it had been because of something I had inadvertently seen, even though I couldn't see anything? The only certainty I had at that moment was that the outside world was no longer safe for me. But how to escape when the only world you know is sound? With my nerves on edge, I picked myself up off the floor, blindly groping around the room. My head was spinning, but my instincts told me I had to move, that I couldn't stay there. At first, I didn't know which way to go. My tactile memory helped me orient myself, and I managed to find my way out of the room. The cold air hit my face as I opened the door, but my mind was fixed on one thought. I have to find the culprit. The sound of the storm intensified as it moved on, but my other senses allowed me to pick up small details. The way the drops fell on the metal roof, the creaking of the windows as they moved in the wind, the sound of the trees swaying, and something else, something that was out of place. Someone was following me. For hours, I moved through the city in the dark, guided by sound and touch. The rain had washed away most of the footprints, but I didn't give up. I needed answers. I needed revenge. My sister's death, which had occurred months ago, continued to haunt me. I didn't understand why she had to die that way. But over time, I began to realize that everything was connected. The crime I was accused of, the attack on my house, my sister's death. Everything was intertwining in a macabre way. My suspicions were soon confirmed when, as I wandered the city looking for something to tell me I wasn't crazy, a person approached me in the dark. I didn't see her, but I could hear her breathing. It was as if everything had stopped around me. And then, the sound of footsteps moving quickly away. Someone had been behind me. But it wasn't a simple thief. It was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. In that instant, I understood the cruel reality. Everything I had thought I knew about my life, about my sister's crime, had been manipulated. I was just a piece in a much bigger game. My heart began to pound with fury, and the fury turned to despair. I was trapped, not just by the culprits, but by the conspiracy that had dragged me down to that moment. For the next few weeks, my life became a constant nightmare. Every step I took, every door I opened, confronted me with the most terrifying truth. My very existence was being manipulated. The persecution was not just physical, it was mental. Something, or someone, was toying with me, pushing me to the limits of despair. making me doubt my own senses, my own judgment. In the end, I found no justice. I did not find revenge. All I found was the echo of my own shadow and a reality that had been imposed on me. Today, in the middle of the storm, with the rain beating against the window, I realized something essential. The truth is not always seen. Sometimes, the only way to find it is through the deepest darkness.